duty and let your voice be heard.
I think it's so important to vote. It is very vital to our society, and also your vote matters, your opinion matters, your voice matters. So it's definitely important to vote, and everyone should do it.
Mason votes.
And now we will go to our correspondent on the street. Meg Thornbury has been standing at the Al Shabin pub in downtown Fairfax, speaking with voters, and also at a Democratic Watch Party for Congressman Gerry Connolly. Hi there, Meg. Okay.
Can you hear us, Meg?
Got technical issues.
Okay, seeing as we're having some technical issues right now, I think we should hop back in to discussing what is going on across Virginia and across the country. We're pretty roundly seeing incumbents winning so far tonight in Virginia. Yeah. Abigail Spanberger's race, Elaine Luria's race, still up in the air in the same way that we were always expecting. Elaine Luria, a member of the January 6th committee, a move that she always knew was going to be, that would always rub against the grain in her district, and we are still waiting to see what that looks like for her. Abigail Spanberger running against Yesli Vega, not the traditional candidate for Republicans in Central Virginia. Yesli Vega running as one of the first candidates of color here in Virginia, one of the first Hispanic candidates of color here in Virginia. What do you think of this campaign? It's been a very not off the cuff, but very non-standard campaign for Republicans. On television, even in the area, in a majority white district with entirely Spanish ads, which I'm not sure, but in many of the places where you would expect these kinds of ads to go, which would be in districts that are swing districts that are relatively urban with a larger Hispanic population than the 7th district. How do you think this plays with traditional Republican voters? This is a very traditional Central Virginia district.
Yeah, and well, it's tough to say because, like as you said, the district itself isn't, Hispanic in a lot of ways. But I mean, I'm going to hold a more positive sort of view here and say that Vega's campaign, obviously, it's working to some degree because the district itself is probably Virginia's second most competitive district after the one you said before. So, at least in my opinion, I think that while it might not be the most well-planned campaign in a lot of ways, I think it definitely is efficacious in a lot of different other ways.
I mean, honestly, I'm just looking at this from, it's been a very well-planned campaign. It's just been a completely unconventional one for Republicans in a district like this, which before this was completely redistricted. Was Abigail Spanberger's district, which ran all the way down to Chesterfield. Before that was represented by a white man, David Bratt. Before that was run by the majority leader of the U.S. House of Representatives, Eric Cantor, who was unseated by Bratt because he wasn't cozying up to the Tea Party. So this is a district that has run to the right and has now run back to the center, but is now seemingly ready for a Trump wave. Or possibly ready for a Trump wave. It's still a very competitive district for Democrats under most situations. What do you think it is in this instance that's holding Abigail Spanberger back thus far in a district that she is currently losing with about 2/3 of the vote in, 53 to 47%?
Well, it's kind of what you said. I think Republicans are just in general running more sort of flavor, colorful campaigns, and this has always been an attack against the Democrats that they tend to run more sort of, I wouldn't say milquetoast. I would never say that, but like more politicians, I guess, is a better word for it. So, and that's in part why I think that it's so competitive. But yeah, I mean, what do you think on the matter?
I mean, yeah, no, I absolutely can agree that this is creating a new paradigm for Republicans to run in districts like this. I think that it's one that Republicans need. Republicans have seen over the last few elections a run of candidates that less and less look like the demographic makeup of the country that we live in. And they've taken hits because of that. And we've seen across the country that Republicans are starting to run an outreach campaign, that they're opening centers in minority districts and minority communities. And we're seeing that pay off for them so far tonight. However, moving back from the 7th district to the 2nd district, we're seeing a very different race play out, which is Elaine Luria's race, where she was, and I'm sorry, but my computer keeps refreshing to the Pennsylvania gubernatorial election, which Elaine Luria is definitely not running in. Where she's losing by about 11 points right now, almost 12 points right now. And she took a very calculated risk. She went on to the January 6th panel. We're still looking at only about half of the votes in so far, so this race could still change, but the numbers so far are not looking good for her, for Miss Luria. And she took a very calculated risk by being on that January 6th panel, hoping that something would come out, hoping that people in her district would look past any attachment to the Trump administration, and then at the same time being redistricted into a more Republican district than she had before. I don't see for her as clear of a way out as an Abigail Spanberger, and I don't see as clear of a way out for her as many Democrats across the country, and in many ways, because of circumstances completely detached from her control. This wasn't a messaging issue. This was a district change issue, and it seems like it's going to run counter to the original intention of her political calculus.
I think that's a common issue, at least for Democrats as a whole. A lot of Democrats were banking on, pointing to a lot of the more radical Republican candidates and pointing to them and saying, like, no, they're Trump acolytes. They want to ban all abortion, including rape and incest cases. And I think this calculation, it paid off briefly in late summer, fall, when we saw Democrats polling incredibly high. But recently, with the inflation problem and a lot of other economic issues, voters are not really seeing this sort of messaging, and they're not really reacting positively to it, I guess.
And I mean, part of that would definitely have to do with the abortion messaging that happened so early on, before even these primaries were finished. I would probably say, and I'd like to know your opinion on this, that Democrats banked very hard on abortion continuing to be the underlying issue for Democratic voters, that it so far has not seemed to be. We'll see by the end of the night. By no means is this evening over, but at the same time, we've had a continual problem looking across this race of Democrats sticking to one message without continuing to adapt that message to a greater to a greater spectrum. Of course, the Dobbs decision was a massive shift in American jurisprudence. But at the same time, in such an uncertain political climate, in such an uncertain international climate, in such an uncertain economic climate, it's impossible to ask people to look at that one issue in a vacuum. And I think that at the end of the day, Republicans have had a more consistent message, have had the right set of circumstances surrounding that message, that Democrats just haven't been able to hold on to more than that singular issue. Now, is that issue paramount? Yes, absolutely. The question is, does that issue stand paramount to all of these other economic and international issues that are still at the forefront of people's minds? And we'll continue this conversation after, but I see now that we have Meg back, and we will be speaking to her at the Old Shebeen.
They're going to cut to me soon, and if you guys just want to Hi, I am here at the Old Shebeen in Old Town Fairfax, where Congressman Connolly has just joined a watch party. Here we have a member of the GMU Democrats.
Hi, my name is Ivana Corey.
So what is the mood like inside the room?
Everyone is very cheerful. The odds for Jerry are looking really, really good tonight. We have lots of food in there, lots of cheering happening, balloons. Everyone's just having a good time.
So today's polling hasn't worn everyone out?
No, I mean, we've been, this whole campaign, we've been really, really working, and I feel like this is the reward after all of it.
All right, well, thank you so much. Just open the door so we can hear what's going on in there. All right, as you can hear, a very boisterous crowd, standing room only private event. But the Connolly campaign is here, supporters are here. They're watching the results come in from other states. Right now, everyone seems very confident that Jerry Connolly is going to win this district, and they're really just seeing who else is going to be in Congress with him working on his agenda come January. Very excited crowd here. And of course, across the street, Catherine Reed is having her across the street, Catherine Reed is having a watch party for her mayoral campaign, and people are going back and forth between the two. So we will have more on that later. Back to you guys.
And unfortunately, I made an incorrect statement earlier that Jerry Connolly had already won his race. Jerry Connolly is currently leading by about 30%. We're still waiting to see where that goes, but for the moment, if trends that have been popping up continue, Jerry Connolly, who has had a long history here in Fairfax and across the 11th District, is the Providence District Supervisor representing Tysons Corner, as the Fairfax County Chairman of the Board of Supervisors, as Congressman, will keep his seat. Can't say, right? But as it stands, Congressman Connolly also, should he be reelected, as it seems he will be a key player moving forward. Congressman Connolly is the president. Congressman Connolly's numbers, as you could see just now on the screen, 69.4% to 30.4% against challenger Jim Miles. But Congressman Connolly is the president of the NATO Parliament. And as we continue to see this conflict play out in Ukraine, as we continue to see aggression from the Russian Federation, he will be a key player, just as all of that NATO Parliament will be in deciding the future of our strategy against the Russian Federation. Well, Gabe, what do you think with Ukraine in the situation that it is now, not getting all of the assistance that it's asked for, but certainly putting forward a good social media campaign, putting forward an amazing ground effort against Russia and against Vladimir Putin, currently winning in that ground effort and taking out infrastructure key to Russia's success. What do you believe is the future of Ukraine with regard to NATO? What do you think is the future of Ukraine as an independent state with its sovereignty being infringed upon in the way that it has been?
Well, as an international affairs major, I could talk your ear off completely about that sort of thing. But the first thing I kind of want to focus on real quick is what will be the likely outcome if, say, the Republicans win the House or also if they win the Senate as well, because there's been a little bit of sparring between the Republicans in the House and the Republicans in the Congress, the Senate, over what a relationship with Ukraine would look like in a post-today election. So that's sort of, the election today is going to play a lot of big factor in this sort of future with Ukraine, because the House Republicans are not so keen on providing aid to Ukraine. So that definitely puts Connolly in an interesting situation, you know?
Absolutely. And, we've seen that from some House Republicans and some Republican candidates who are not yet in the House. Minority leader, not yet Speaker, or Majority Leader, Kevin McCarthy, did speak earlier this year, just last month, about no longer providing assistance to Ukraine in the way that the Biden administration has been over the past year since Russia invaded in February, but also having to walk that back. We've seen a massive shift in Republican, or at least Republican leadership's approach to speaking on Ukraine in the last month, because they saw a turnoff in voters who were around the center, and they were trying to win those voters back. What do you think Republican messaging around this is going to be if they win on at least a partially pro-Ukraine platform tonight?
It's tough, because that's sort of the theme of tonight. Is it's going to be tough deciding the future, because, like I said, the Republicans are just so divided on this issue. It's going to be very hard to predict anything. And I definitely, if in the case that the Republicans win the House but not the Senate, we could see a future in which there's less aid going to Ukraine on this matter. But overall, even the Republicans don't know the answer to this question. Yeah. So it's definitely like a wait and see sort of thing.
And you're certainly right. Republicans have been incredibly divided on some of these issues, have been incredibly divided across their platform. We've seen a Republican Party in this last year that is sort of run, in some cases, on a run now, create a platform later approach, which is questionable on a governing standpoint, but has certainly worked out for them on the campaign trail.
Well, yeah, because I'm sure we could argue, or the viewers can argue, or whatever, but at the very least, up till now, the Republicans didn't really have a sort of core area of attack, but with inflation, boom, they just got their big ticket selling item on the campaign. Inflation, the economy, jobs, that's the focus of Republicans now. And that was up till recently that they didn't have that on their platform. It was just sort of honing in on abortion and all that stuff. So yeah.
And I know we're going to be hearing something shortly from an interview with Professor Jennifer Victor, who spoke about the Congress's future, about American democracy, and also on the issues driving this Congress, or at least these congressional races. Why don't we lead into that?
All right, cool. Yeah.
Hi everyone, my name is Taylor Ramirez, and I am a senior here in the Schar School, majoring in government and international politics and minoring in journalism. And I'm here today with Dr. Victor, who is a professor here in the Schar School. So can you just go ahead and introduce yourself and what your role is here at Mason?
Sure. I'm Jennifer Nicole Victor. I'm an associate professor of political science. My area of expertise is in American politics, mostly focused on the US Congress. And I've been at Mason for about 10 years on the faculty here. Before that, I was on the political science faculty at the University of Pittsburgh.
And so what first sparked your interest in politics and government, or more specifically, United States politics and government?
I'm one of those weird kids that was always interested in politics in some way. So the origin story I usually tell is when I was in the 4th grade, there was a big hopscotch craze at my school, and there weren't enough hopscotch courts. And I was the kid that organized like a petition that we took to the principal's office to try to get the school to make more hopscotch courts. Okay. And it was a big deal, and we walked it into the principal's office and all of this. So from a very young age, I had this idea that you could use the powers of the people or the institutions or something, of course I didn't use those words at the time, to try to make the world better for people. And so that idea of politics, organizing, institutions was sort of always there for me, I guess. The end of that story, by the way, is they did make new hopscotch courts, but not until we were in the 6th grade, and hopscotch was no longer cool.
Which is a little bit similar to government. Things take a little while.
There you go.
to actually see some results. So that's a great story. So I know also, in addition to being a professor here in the Schar School, you're the co-editor of the Oxford Handbook of Political Networks. I know you work with Open Secrets, if I remember correctly.
I'm on their board of directors.
Okay, and so I was just wondering, what are some of the things that you've been talking about or focusing on in those spaces outside of George Mason and your life as a professor here ahead of the midterm elections? What are the conversations happening? What are the kind of hot button issues?
Yeah. So campaign finance has always been an area of interest of mine. I've been on the board of directors for Open Secrets, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group in DC that helps to make campaign finance and lobbying and all sorts of money and politics issues more transparent to people. I've been on their board for, I don't know, a few years. Can't remember when I joined. And it's not a paid role. Like, I'm basically a volunteer, sort of occasional consultant on things type thing. There's just been a lot that has changed in the last 10 years on campaign finance and the way that money operates in our politics. That it can be an overwhelming, confusing space, and it can be hard to understand the relationship between what goes on in that space and the outcomes that we see in terms of who wins elections or whatnot. So for example, in this election cycle, there's been a lot of focus on just the price tag of elections. So Open Secrets is estimating that this election is, when all is said and done, is going to be somewhere around the $10 billion mark, which is a lot. So it'll be the most expensive midterm election that we've ever had. And in 2020, we also practically double, we broke all records by a long shot. It was almost 15 billion in that year. And so the way that I've started to think about this, or the metaphor that I think is quite useful in modern context, is to think about this as campaign inflation, right? So if you talk to an economist about economic inflation, consumer inflation that we observe, they will talk about it as too much money chasing too few products, right? And so you can think of campaign inflation, the cost of campaigns, in that same way, where there's a lot of donors, there's a lot of money out there, a lot of people who would like to participate in the contest, and basically not enough candidates to donate to. And so over the last 10 years, we've changed the laws so that instead of giving the money directly to candidates, you can just use the money as an external expenditure, an independent expenditure, to just make your own ads about the candidates or nominally about them. And so we just have an overabundance of spending going on in campaign politics in a way that is really alarming to a lot of people. I mean, on the one hand, I don't know how much democracy should cost, right? Yes, they are huge price tags. The fact that it's been going up so quickly and at such a steep pace, I think, is a bit alarming. But it's not the price tag itself that bothers me. It's the distribution of who is getting involved in that system and what the money says about who is able to sort of play the game and what the money is able to do, that I think leaves a lot of room for concern.
Mm-hmm. I know you just mentioned the 2020 election. I remember taking your election class in 2020, and which that election was, as you said, unprecedented and broke records for many different reasons. Mm-hmm. So do you think that this election is different, is the same? What kind of patterns are we seeing repeat themselves, or is completely new in this cycle?
So in a lot of ways, I think this midterm election is a little bit more textbook than prior elections. So without a presidential candidate on the ballot, it changes, in almost some ways lowers the stakes of elections. It lowers the population of people who are paying attention to it or who are getting, engaged with it in the same way. And of course, we don't know exactly how the elections. This is being recorded the day before Election Day, so we don't know how things are going to come out. But it's very much looking like that we will have the type of result that we would sort of expect. So the trend in midterm elections is that the party in power tends to lose seats. It's thought of as a referendum, and any sort of negativity is blamed on that party. So right now, the big economic concern is about inflation. So the Democrats are being blamed, rightly or wrongly, for that economic outlook. And so that gives Republicans sort of a structural advantage. So if you look at the political science forecasts of this election, those forecasts are usually made in the summer, like June, July, before you know what the big issues are, or even like what the candidate controversies or scandals are. Like, you don't even hardly know everybody who's on the ballot yet. And those models just look at which party holds the presidency, how popular is the president, and a couple of other like broad indicators about the economy and so forth. And those models indicate that Democrats should expect to lose between 40 and 50 seats in the House. Just on those structural features of the election alone, not months before the election. I think that Republicans, particularly in the Senate, have advanced a number of not very good candidates that have been vulnerable and easy to criticize from a number of angles. That makes a bit of a difference. Democrats have also gotten a bit of a boost from the Dobbs decision that came out in the summer that disrupted abortion rights and access to abortion for millions of Americans, and that has created a galvanizing political force for people who support abortion rights. And so for that and other sort of broader factors that I maybe won't go into, I think we can probably expect that structural trend of Democrats losing seats will hold, but it's probably going to be narrower. But if you want to just give yourself a baseline expectation for tomorrow night, I would say that if the Democrats lose anything less than 25 seats, then they have essentially beat expectations. Like, I often think of elections as what should our expectation be going in? My expectation, all else being equal, is Democrats should lose about 25 seats in the House. So if they lose anything less than that, then that is a sign of some benefit of campaigning or organizing or something else that either Republicans have done wrong or Democrats have done right.
So another question is, I follow you on Twitter, and something
Twitter.
Something that you said recently, which I found interesting, was that you described this election as having the power to slide the U.S. further towards authoritarianism or modestly reinforce democratic institutions. So obviously we are all hopeful for the latter because democracy is a good thing, but I guess my question would be, what do we do as young people who are kind of have a lot at stake, and we're just entering this new electorate and its new polarized environment? What do we do if it is, sliding us further towards authoritarianism, or what are the next steps people should be taking or thinking about?
No, that's a great question. So before I answer that, though, I would say it's important to know what it looks like to be sliding into authoritarianism. I think a lot of folks are under the impression that there will be some big event or some flashing sign that says democracy is dead now and we are a competitive authoritarian country or something like that. And it's not going to be like that. Democracies that decline very slowly. It's like a frog in boiling water, doesn't even realize it's happening to them until they're dead, kind of thing. And that's essentially where the United States, we're at the frog boiling stage of democratic decline. And so just being able to understand what are the specific things that happen that we would identify as being as depleting the democratic institutions. And in this particular election, what I'm looking at is the number of people who get elected to office who deny election results. Either people who win or who lose, and I'm not sure whether they win or lose is really determinative of the attitude that they take, but whether they have won or they have lost, if they accept the outcome of the election, if they honor that outcome in a way that doesn't challenge the institution of elections. So there are a number of congressional candidates on the ballot that have called into question the 2020 election. And so how they respond to this election, either graciously or not in winning or losing, I think will be important. There's a number of governors on the ballot that are also sort of election denier or calling into question the institutions of democracy. Carrie Lake comes to mind of Arizona. So she is sort of a Trump firebrand style politician who is probably going to get elected tomorrow. And so looking at the type of rhetoric that she uses as either, it's interesting to be in a position of winning an election and then calling into question the validity of the institution. Mm-hmm. But I have a feeling that's what we're going to see from candidates like her tomorrow. So that's interesting to me. And then the third place to look for it is in a few Secretary of State offices. So this is not the type of candidacy that Americans usually pay attention to, but there's 20 some odd Secretaries of State on the ballot tomorrow in different states. And secretaries of state in most states are the office holder that is in charge of running elections. So the people that we elect tomorrow, or that a bunch of states are electing tomorrow, will be the people who are in charge during the 2024 presidential election. And particularly in Arizona and Nevada, there are Secretary of State candidates who are either explicitly or implicitly or have questioned the election validity of 2020. And so if we get lots of election denying folks who get elected and who are continuing to use that rhetoric as a way to build their political coalition, that is damaging to democracy and gives me some pause about how healthy the 2024 cycle, which begins in just 2 days, by the way, is going to be. But to your original question about, okay, so if that is what in fact happens and things continue to decline, which is basically what we expect, what should we do, or what should young people do to react to that? And I would say, I mean, it sounds so simple, but I really think the answers are quite simple. It's be engaged. It's join a campaign, join an organization, join a community organization, participate in your local community or with local politics. It doesn't even have to be something political, but anything that connects you to your community, however you want to define that, is the type of thing that can help reinforce some of those basic democratic fibers, I think. And beyond that, just, calling stuff out when you see it, trying to not participate in, because some of what's going on in politics right now is the politicians who are counting on stimulating that emotional response that people get when you take delight in somebody else's pain, or when you take delight in being insulting towards others. Like that sort of very base human instinct that basically we all have. If we're attracted to people who are doing that, it creates a much less productive kind of politics. That doesn't tend to serve the broader population. And so just being aware of that and noticing when politicians are doing that and trying not to elevate those politicians. Even by pointing it out, actually, we can elevate it, which puts us in a bit of a conundrum. So anyway.
No, it's good advice. It's good advice. Shifting gears a little bit and starting to wrap up, can you describe the study that your Democracy Lab students are doing here on campus with the voting study and what you guys are looking to find?
Yeah, I hesitate to describe it too much because the study isn't over yet. Okay. But basically we want to understand voting behavior and election participation among college students. So, and particularly among residential college students. So yes, Mason has 30,000 undergraduate students. Is that right? Something like that? Something like that. But only like 6,500 or so live on campus. But not just from Mason, but from all of universities across the country, we know that residential college students are a very particular kind of voting population that faces a lot of barriers to voting. So if you are living on campus at a university, by definition, you have just moved from someplace else. And people who have just moved and are living in a new community, that alone is a characteristic that makes people less likely to vote. Plus, voting on campus can be very confusing. Sometimes students aren't sure if they vote in the district where they live now on campus, or if they vote back home, or do they get a choice? Do they have to change their driver's license? Or it can be very, very confusing. And frankly, it varies based on where people live. So in
Apologies for that. We had a small mechanical failure. But now we're going to return to Meg Thornbury, who it seems is speaking to Catherine Reed, who just won her election for mayor of Fairfax City.
All right.
Hi, I am here at Catherine Reed's watch party, which is happening in the plaza just across the street from Jerry Connolly's. Right now, they are celebrating Catherine's win. Representative Connolly actually just came over to congratulate her, so the mood here is incredibly boisterous, incredibly excited, young, old. People are here with their families, people are here with their kids. We are just trying to get through the crowd to get a chance to talk to someone. Everybody is lining up to congratulate her on her historic win, but hopefully she will be out to talk to us in a minute. She is a George Mason alum, and that was a big part of her campaign. She is the first George Mason alum to ever be mayor. So hopefully with that and with some of her connections on city council, we're really hoping to build those bridges between the university and the larger Fairfax community in a way that often gets ignored. As Professor Victor said in the interview we just saw, a lot of Mason students move here from somewhere else and don't necessarily consider Fairfax outside of the campus to be their home, despite the fact that this is very much the district they're represented in, whether you're talking about Congress, you're talking about being represented on the Fairfax County Board of Supervisors, or you're really talking about being represented by Fairfax City government. Mason students fall within all of those districts. And we saw a large voter turnout at Mason today. Those ballots did include the spots for all of the candidates, including Catherine Reed, who is here with us today. Thank you so much for joining us.
Absolutely.
So you are a Mason alum.
I am a Mason alum.
That is awesome. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you first got started in politics?
So I transferred to George Mason University in 1981. I moved into the very first dormitories ever built at George Mason University. Moved in on October 25th, 1981. And the reason I even knew about George Mason was because I was at Emerson College in Boston as a theater major, and their debate team, because I was on the forensics team, like kicked everybody's butt. Mason had the #1 debate team in the nation in 1981, 2 decades after. So I ended up transferring back in-state and getting in-state tuition and changing my major to government politics. And so I graduated in January of 1984 with a degree in government politics, got married, had kids, 2 of them are inside, stayed in this area, and have done a lot of things not necessarily tied to that degree, but I do legislative advocacy. And so I've been in the political world for a long time, probably 15 years in Fairfax City.
And what are you hoping to see for Fairfax going forward as mayor?
An openness to innovation, first of all, an inclusion that we have not seen on the level I think we should. When we had May elections, less than 20% of registered voters ever voted in them. We moved them to November and like 52% of the electorate voted. That's an enormous difference. Thousands of people voted who had never voted before. And so people's voices need to be heard, and we need to go out and meet them where they are.
And what are you doing to hear those voices and to get them where they are?
I think it's important to go where the people are. So we have a Korean American community here that may not always feel that they are comfortable in places like City Hall, but we need to be where they are in their communities, because language is sometimes a barrier, and the same for our Hispanic community as well. Sometimes language is a barrier. We need to go where people are already gathered. That might be faith communities, it might be other kinds of programs where people know each other. And so I sort of feel like I hope people will welcome me into their groups as their mayor so that I can better understand what their concerns are and what their goals are for the city.
And the Mason campus is often a community where students are gathered and tend to remain fairly insular. What are you doing to reach out to students, and what do you think students should do to reach out to you?
They need to invite me places. Because that's the thing. If you want me to show up somewhere as mayor, I'm ready to show up and listen. Let me know. I will look for those opportunities. The fact of the matter is, I am open to students saying this is something they want to talk about. So I was on the board of Equality Virginia for 7.5 years. I'm on the board of PV Advocates. We've never had a pride event in Fairfax City, and I would like to do that. So that's just an example. It would be wonderful. It's just an example of something we've never had. If we could and should have, it's a priority for me.
And I think a lot of Mason students don't really actually even know that they're part of
of the city of Fairfax. How do Fairfax politics and Fairfax government affect students?
Absolutely, they don't understand that. And having the flats at University in the city is going to be a game changer for our downtown. It's going to bring in far more robust businesses. The economy is going to thrive. We've got feet on the street. So people in Fairfax City need to understand the power of students when they live right here in the center of our city. And as far as the campus goes, we need to have more reasons for the students to come in the city, and we need to do things on the campus that bring residents out to the campus, because it's not like there's a moat and a drawbridge between the two.
Right. So this is a fairly historic one for you on a number of counts. Can you just tell us one of the things you're excited about?
Well, first of all, I didn't run on being the first woman mayor because we understand how that worked for Hillary. Yeah, it didn't. And I didn't really talk about being the first Mason alumni to ever win the mayor's seat, even though I think it's significant that the university is 50 years old, the city is 61 years old, and there's never been a mayor who's a Mason alumni, and we're like right next door. So those to me are very historic things. But I just think I'm a person of ideas, and I look at things that are innovative. And while people like to celebrate the neighborliness and the quaint aspects of the city, there has to be more than that. Not everybody wants that experience.
All right, well, thank you so much. Do you have any parting shot you want to leave us with?
I think that more students like Billy Bates, who ran for city council, need to understand that local government's where it's at. The government closest to your front door is what impacts the quality of your life. And more young people should look for mentors like me to give them opportunities, coach them, support them, and open doors for them so that when people are ready, as Billy is, there are opportunities, real opportunities to do something substantive.
And how do you recommend students go about it?
Well, I have an email address. But actually finding mentorship is really important. There are programs like Women in Business at Mason that actually are mentorship programs. I don't even know if there are other kinds of mentorship programs at Mason. But that is a great way to pair up people in the city and people in the region with students who have specific interests.
All right, thank you so much. Congratulations.
Thank you very much.
Enjoy the rest of your night.
Thank
It
you
sounds
very
like
much.
it's a real good time.
Oh my God, it's great. I'm so excited.
Meg, I know you're watching, so I just saw Braddock District Supervisor James Walkinshaw walk behind you. If you could try and get him on, that would be wonderful. He represents George Mason, Northern Virginia Community College, for our viewers to know, and the surrounding area. Anyway, for the moment, we're going to go. Oh, I'm sorry, Meg. You were going to say something. I'm so sorry.
Oh, no, I was just going to say that I can certainly try, although the supervisor and the congressman are just surrounded by well-wishers and supporters at this moment. So I'll see what I can do, but no promises at this time. May have to be a follow-up.
Not bound by that at all. I appreciate it. I'm sure this seems to be a very good night for Congressman Connolly, for Supervisor Walkinshaw, and for now Mayor-elect Reed. So thank you so much for that interview. That was great. Now we're going to move on. We're going to go to incoming election results. Here in Virginia, we are watching still those key races in the Virginia 2nd and in the Virginia 7th. Do you have anything going on with those right now?
Yeah, so for the Virginia 7th, Spanberger's district, currently things are looking very tight, with Spanberger at 47 and Vega at 52. This is at 74% reporting as well, so things are looking very tight. And if things keep on trending the way they currently are, we can probably see Spanberger losing her district. But as for the 10th, Wexton's district, things are looking pretty good for her. 51 for Wexton, 48 for Hunkow, 74% reporting in. And as I said, if the things keep on trending the way things are trending, Wexton can see a win there.
And I'm looking down at the 2nd district, where Elaine Luria is running against my apologies, her Republican challenger, Kiggins, who seems to still be holding steady at about 2/3 of the vote, 12 points ahead. It seems very likely at this moment, based on the number of votes that have been cast, or the number of votes that have been counted, as though Elaine Luria may very well lose her seat tonight, making that initial move to join the January 6th committee. Apart from being the very moderate member of Congress from the Democratic Party that she had run on as her platform making that move almost moot in a district that leans Republican, that was redistricted even more Republican, and which she very narrowly won from Scott Taylor in 2018. Moving on, though, we are also looking at a race in Maryland, or in two races in Maryland, a senatorial race and a gubernatorial race. That Senate race is with Chris Van Hollen, congressman formerly from the Maryland 6th. He has won his race, but moving on to Wes Moore against Dan Cox, the Republican challenger. Wes Moore is poised at 67.1%. Dan Cox at 30.3%. Wes Moore is someone who has never run for elective office before. Against Dan Cox, a Maryland General Assembly member who ran a very pro Make America Great Again MAGA campaign. Wes Moore also very much vying for a White House spot for the presidency, should, or at least his backers are vying for him to run for the presidency, should President Joe Biden not seek a second term. We've seen this before.
Yeah.
We've seen this before. Someone who has never run for elective office or has run for minor elective office making huge leaps and bounds towards the presidency. In fact, we just left it. So what does it look like if a Wes Moore, someone who will at that point have had exactly 2 years of political experience, runs for the presidency, exactly 8 years since Donald Trump ran for his first election for the presidency?
It's really indicative of the political climate we're in, because I feel like it's every other governorship, every other important position in like every state or Atlantic national seat. There always feels like that dynamic of like for Youngkin, for example, he's relatively new, and people are saying he's already angling for the presidency spot, and it's just I feel like it's indicative of the environment, and it's interesting to see how this will play out in the long term, because obviously it worked for Trump, but for these sort of aspiring politicians, kind of like in the middle, we'll see how it kind of plays in the long term, if they can actually,
Yeah, absolutely. And it did work for Trump, but it worked for Trump in a completely different climate. It worked for Trump in well, maybe not a different climate, but certainly a different circumstance, where Trump had a lot of airtime. He had name recognition that nobody else had at a time when we were running out of an 8-year presidency. There was no incumbent to take that spot. So what does it look like when there is that incumbent? I mean, we're looking at a situation where Joe Biden seems to have said that he will be running. Does a Wes Moore step into that race? Does, for that matter, a Bernie Sanders or will there be a spoiler in the Democratic Party for what would otherwise be an uncontested primary?
It's the same with the Republicans too, because Trump himself said he's going to possibly run soon. He's going to make the announcement soon that he's going to run for 2024. Yeah. So with Biden and Trump sort of angling for a 2024 sort of presidential race, with these other sort of middle politicians, it's going to be interesting to see where they sort of position themselves, because they could maybe compete in primaries against these figures, but will that help their political career? I mean, who knows? But I mean, what do you think?
Yeah, no, absolutely, and you know what, I think you've said what needs to be said on that. But running on that announcement that Donald Trump has made, that he will have an announcement in a week, on November 15th, we're going to be hearing from Donald Trump, likely on whether or not he's running for the presidency again for the third time for a second term. And we've also heard a pretty big escalation in the last couple of weeks between Donald Trump and Ron DeSantis, who just won his election down in Florida, just finished his victory speech. What does that look like? We've seen Donald Trump as someone who loves nicknames. He gave, I'm going to make a personal point of privilege here and say a pretty lame nickname for Ron DeSantis, where he's had some success with nicknames before. Little Marco,
Sleepy Joe.
Sleepy Joe is not OG Trump, but still a Trump. what does it look like with Ron DeSanctimonious, and what does it look like between Ron DeSantis, who has taken a lot of cues from Trump, both on a political level, but also on a public speaking level? You've seen his body language, the way he speaks to people has changed in the last 4 years.
Yeah.
What does that look like if they go head to head? Will it be a Trump and a proto-Trump, or will it be Trump and then what people expected to be Trump light, but has become Trump extra?
Yeah. For my conservative friends, a lot of them are more supportive of DeSantis because he embodies a lot of the same traits Trump does, but in a more professional way, something that's more packageable to the mainstream sort of media, public, I guess. So in that regard, but when it comes down to the primary, though, Trump just has that backing, that name recognition. I'm not saying DeSantis doesn't, but it's Trump. I mean, he not landslide, but he big upset in 2016, 4 years of governance in the White House, and there's a lot more to his name than DeSantis, because I mean DeSantis, at least nationally, might not have as much clout than Trump. I guess.
We all remember that ad that he had when he was running for Congress, and it was that he was running on being, a father, but the entire time he's, teaching his child build the wall, and he's teaching his child how to say "Make America Great Again," and he became the proto-Trump very early on, but now he seems. I mean, even in that more applicable to the mainstream that you're talking about, to have gone harder against the press in some ways as governor of Florida, he seems to have gone further to the right than Trump. He's certainly been hitting Trump on COVID response, saying that Trump was too COVID restriction heavy.
Yeah.
When I would probably say that most Americans don't look on COVID restrictions, or at least the majority of American voters, as we've seen, don't look on COVID restrictions quite so much as a negative. It certainly plays in Florida. It plays to the base. The question is, does the base abandon Trump for DeSantis? Or if Trump runs, does the polling that's played out from everything from CPAC rallies to likely voters that Donald Trump still dominates the Republican Party still stand?
On the issues that matter, I don't think DeSantis can pin Trump on anything. COVID is a issue that has sort of died. No one really cares about COVID anymore. But yeah, so like on the issues that matter, I don't think DeSantis has any sort of way to pin down Trump. It has to be probably more like personal attack issues, like I don't know, stuff like pinning them down on COVID things, which are kind of loosey-goosey. So
no, absolutely, and we've seen this week Tom Cotton, the senator from Arkansas, who was a hopeful for a presidential run in 2024, has dropped any exploration, has made it clear and announced that he's not running. Do you think that kind of a personal attack structure is what's keeping Republicans who are even relatively more conservative Republicans like Tom Cotton out of the race, or do you think it's something else?
It's tough to say. Republican strategy has gone through radical change recently, very radical change, and it is constantly changing. And the attacks, though, they do tend to alienate the moderates, like Liz Cheney. When she but when she joined the Democrats on the January 6th committee, that ended her career, I guess, politically with the Republicans, and subsequently lost the primary in Wyoming. So I mean, the sharp rhetoric definitely does alienate the moderates, which is important, at least in some districts and states.
And we're still looking at how that January 6th panel plays out for people politically, plays out for the members politically. Many of those members are in safe districts, but people like Liz Cheney, who lost her primary, people like Adam Kinzinger, who has decided to retire from the House entirely, they may have different standards for the future of their political career. As it stands, Liz Cheney is anticipating, or at least exploring, a run for the presidency in 2024. I don't think anybody is expecting her necessarily to win, particularly in the Republican Party that exists now. But what do you think that looks like if she's running essentially as a counter to Trump?
Nationally, I don't think any sort of counter to Trump would gain traction. It's definitely nationally a DeSantis-Trump situation. However, statewide, it could play a little bit better, like we see with like Youngkin and like Hogan. Not, but he's moved on. But for the most part, at least Kemp, I guess too. At least statewide, the playing against Trump definitely works, but nationally, it's a dead issue. No way it's going to get any traction.
And actually, running back because you just said Larry Hogan to the election results that we're looking at right now from Maryland, between Wes Moore and Dan Cox. Dan Cox and Larry Hogan are two worlds apart. In fact, they might be galaxies apart in their politics. What does this say about the Trump message, particularly in these mid-Atlantic states, particularly in states like Virginia, like Maryland, like Delaware, where Lisa Blunt Rochester, who's the at-large House member, has just won re-election as well, and Pennsylvania, where we're watching Doug Mastriano take a lot of the same hits that Dan Cox did during his election or during his run.
I don't think the Trump rhetoric works in maybe in some of these tighter races like Maryland, which is a pretty blue. It's a pretty blue state,
as opposed to Pennsylvania, which is very much a swing state in the last few years.
But yeah, like Larry Hogan's case is such an oddity, though, at least politically, because. Like I said, it's a very blue state, but a red Republican it still polls very well in Maryland. So it definitely it's an interesting case for sure.
Yeah, absolutely. And by the way, for the other races that have been coming in throughout the night, we have seen some incumbents retain their seats. That includes in Connecticut, Richard Blumenthal, who just won re-election, 56 to 43 so far, with only about 17% of the vote in. But we'll be looking at those results as they evolve. Senator Chuck Schumer, Senate Majority Leader, hoping to keep his seat in the Majority Leader's office, is currently running ahead and has been projected the winner of his election, currently standing at 71.9% to 27.7%.
To no surprise.
To no one's surprise.
To no surprise.
And not yet a called race, but still ahead is Maggie Hassan, who is beating, I believe it's Tim Baldock?
It's Don.
Don Baldock, apologies. Don Baldock at 58.5% to 39.4%. We are continuing to watch these races as they come in. Across the country, we are seeing races that were slated for their incumbents in Indiana, North Dakota, South Dakota, Oklahoma. Jim Langford kept his seat. Kansas, Arkansas, Alabama, and Florida, where Marco Rubio beat Democratic hopeful Val Demings, former Orlando City Police Chief, and Congressperson from the Florida 10th. But as these continue coming in, we will be watching them. In the meantime, we're going to bring it back to our local races. And I know you got a chance to speak to Billy Bates.
Yeah, I did.
How was that?
So Billy Bates is a student of George Mason. He studies physics here at George Mason. So if you guys ever want to maybe try and find him on campus, definitely look at Planetary and Exploratory Hall. But yeah, I got a chance to speak with Billy Bates. He's running for the Fairfax City Council, to which we'll see the results to later, hopefully. But yeah, it's he'll be the first student to, the first student, I guess, in general to really run for a local office and win. It's something you rarely hear of.
Especially here at Mason, a college which has only existed for 50 years independently and just over 65 years as an arm of the University of Virginia before that. So that's interesting to see. And here is Gabe's conversation with Billy Bates.
Hi, my name is Gabriel Yasik. I'm
All right.
So can you tell us who you're with here today?
All right, and we're back. Sorry, there were some technical issues. In the meantime, we'll continue talking about
races that are coming in,
Exactly.
talking about the platforms that we've been seeing as winning platforms versus losing platforms tonight. So far in Northern Virginia, across Arlington County and Fairfax City,
Hi,
we
my
have
name
not
is Gabriel.
seen any conclusive results. In Arlington County, there's been a massive push regarding housing, a missing middle plan for upzoning, which means creating more densely occupied properties in residential areas. And that has led to a more contentious race between incumbent Chairman Matt DeFerranti and perennial candidate Audrey Clement, who has been running every year, I believe, since 2004 for the Arlington County Board here in Fairfax City. For the 6 seats on the City Council, we have not seen any of the 9 candidates results break yet, so we're still at 0% precincts reporting. We hope that changes soon. We'll be keeping an eye on the Virginia Department of Elections website to see that precinct by precinct. But in the meantime, we're still looking in Pennsylvania, in Georgia, in Colorado, where there are particularly tight races. In Colorado and in Georgia so far, we have seen an advantage towards the Democratic candidates, but it's very close. Senator Raphael Warnock, who won just 2 years ago, is now, and he won that seat, taking the seat that had been vacated by the late Senator Johnny Isakson. Senator Warnock is currently leading 49.3% to 48.9%. If that continues in that trend, we will be seeing a runoff, seeing as Georgia is an outright majority state. If you do not win 50 or more percent, you will be running off.
Do you think it's going to go to a runoff?
It's perfectly possible that it does, particularly in the way that it's going right now.
Yeah.
We're seeing that there is enough time for. I'm sorry. That there is enough support for the Libertarian candidate that it can push some support away from both Herschel Walker, who has been able to narrow that gap over the last few weeks, but also to narrow support for Senator Warnock in a state that has traditionally been more conservative.
Yeah.
The first time that Georgia had gone blue before 2022 was for Jimmy Carter, the last time before Joe Biden was for President Clinton. And before that, Jimmy Carter. Before that, it had been a red state since the Dixiecrats. I mean, so we're not looking at a race that will be conclusive, and we're not looking at a race that we'll certainly know by tonight. Looking forward, and honestly, this race keeps on jumping around. They've just jumped from a lead for Senator Warnock to now being a 49.1 to 49.1 tie between Senator Warnock and his challenger, former University of Georgia football player Herschel Walker. So we'll be watching that throughout the night. We'll be watching that over the course of the next likely couple of days, as opposed to other seats in that state, including Governor Brian Kemp, who seems poised to win by a healthy margin against Stacey Abrams, the Democratic strategist, the Democratic nominee for governor there in that state, who came very close in 2018, but it seems will not be holding that margin tonight.
Same for in Texas with Beto O'Rourke back in 2018. It was a very tight race against Abbott, but
absolutely. Well, in 2018 it was against Ted Cruz. And Ted Cruz is a very different candidate from Greg Abbott, who is much less liked. Ted Cruz is much less liked than Greg Abbott in the state of Texas. Greg Abbott has been able to hold on to relative popularity across the state of Texas throughout his career, and Beto O'Rourke, in what many saw as a misstep at the time, said that he, believed after his presidential run that he shouldn't run against John Cornyn, and that he shouldn't seek a lower office because he would best serve Texans as president of the United States. And that for lack of a better word, and I'm going to try and find a better word in the next couple minutes. You know what? That kneecapped him.
Yeah.
You know, I was.
It definitely gives off the image that he's looking for a political position wherever it may be. It seems like he's an opportunist.
Well, I mean, yeah, it made him seem like an opportunist, where many people before that point did not see Beto O'Rourke as a perennial candidate in the way that he has become for Texans.
Yeah.
I think if you're looking at this race, clearly you're seeing a Beto O'Rourke that has a very different appeal to a very different subset of Americans than the Beto O'Rourke that originally ran against Ted Cruz, which was an appealing candidate to Texans, which was an appealing alternative to Ted Cruz's Republicanism. But in a Texas that is traditionally red, in a Texas that, despite the recent tragedy in Uvalde, has traditionally held very strong Second Amendment views, which are being challenged, no doubt tonight, in swing districts across the state. There is a break. There is a strong break in how people viewed Beto O'Rourke as this very independent person back in 2018, and how they view him more as a perennial candidate now, as someone who is somewhat detached from Texas values now, particularly the independent voters that he would need to get over the edge or over the finish line. Now we're going to go to a video. I'm not sure.
The Billy Bates.
The Billy Bates video,
yeah.
Which I think we've gotten running again.
Hi, my name is Gabriel Yasik. I'm with Mason Votes, and today I have Billy Bates. Billy, could you introduce yourself to the audience, please?
Hi, I'm Billy Bates. I'm a candidate for City Council in Fairfax City.
All right. Why are you running for the council seat in Fairfax?
So when I first started running, I basically just decided I had a long list of different issues that I've been advocating for several years for the council, and I felt that running for city council was the best way of, at the very least, getting the word out about different things that we can be doing in Fairfax City that people might not be aware that we can be doing, or might not be aware that we aren't already doing. And I've found that to be the case. A lot of people are very excited about my platform, recently we have a Republican slate who are trying to call themselves nonpartisan, even though they're very partisan. And it was recently reported in Patch that Sang Yee, the candidate for mayor, had a closed-door private fundraiser with Glenn Youngkin as guest of honor, and yet he and his council candidate recruits are still trying to call themselves nonpartisan. And that's really been the main driving force behind my campaign, trying to do my part and make sure that we don't have the conservatives take over the city council by misrepresenting themselves in Fairfax City of all places.
Gotcha. So what do you hope to accomplish during your tenure as city council, on the city council?
So I have a very extensive platform. A few of the main points. I'd like the council to be more accepting of significant affordable housing projects, low-income housing projects by nonprofits, more so than they have been in the past. And I'd like to pass a police review board, which the county has had for some time, but I want to establish one with active disciplinary powers and investigatory powers and the power to review internal investigations, etc. To add that extra level of transparency, which is frankly lacking right now with the Fairfax City Police Department, but also foster a greater sense of collaboration between the police and the community, and just make sure that we're being proactive rather than reactive, so that, first off, we're able to find out when there's been a complaint made through public records that would come with such board, but also so that victims of police brutality, Lord forbid, have a recourse that they can go through. And this body would be appointed by the city council and accountable to the city council. It's totally independent of the police department. And another thing is we have in Fairfax, where George Mason is, a gun ban in county government buildings and county parks and events. And the penalty for a violation of that ban is a Class 1 misdemeanor, which maximum penalty is, very high. And on the other hand, it only applies to buildings, not to city events, and the penalty is a Class 4 misdemeanor. See, in Virginia, all cities are independent cities. That means that they're not part of a county, they're a separate county equivalent, so the county ordinance does not city. So if you're in Fairfax City, you can have guns at like the 4th of July parade, etc., even without a permit if you're open carrying. And the penalty is Class 4 misdemeanor, which is a max of a $2 fine. Not much of a disincentive for to have a gun. And so that's something else I want to change. Those are really the main points. My platform can be found on my website, batesforfairfax.com.
Yeah, you're pretty well read on these issues. So I guess how important do you think student involvement is in our communities and communities in general, I guess?
Of the utmost importance, really, for the functioning of our democracy, to make sure that every voice is heard in the process, and that the people we elect, and most importantly, the policies that they're putting in place are reflective of the entire demographics of the community. And some of the Mason students are city residents, so they'll be voting in this election. Voting is going in the November election from tomorrow is the last day. Also going on today and 5, I believe, and then election day, of course, is Tuesday. And everybody's going to be voting for our member of Congress. Only city residents are going to be voting for the mayor and city council, the county. So if you're registered to vote in the county, you're only voting for Congress. But next year we will have a county board election, and they're basically our counterpart with the county.
Gotcha. Well, anything else, Billy?
Just get out and vote. Student representation in the electorate is usually very low, disproportionately low turnout among students. So it's of the utmost importance that we remind our friends to vote, even if we think they might already be voting. Wrong about that, and just make sure that they realize how important this election is, everything that's on the line, equity, women's rights, public safety, and just make sure that they're getting out to vote. And like I said, that the election is as effective as possible for the sake of our democracy.
Gotcha. Well, thank you for chatting. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
Historically, young people have not been a particularly reliable voting bloc in the United States of America, but a new generation of Americans are now entering the age of majority, including Maxwell Frost in the Florida 10th, who is the first Gen Z member of Congress and won his seat, formerly held by Congresswoman Val Demings, in the 10th District of Florida. Let's now turn it over to Meg, who spoke with a few George Mason students, some of whom are voting for the first time in a federal election, as they were leaving the polls, and find out why they came out to vote today.
So
right.
can you tell us who you're with here today?
Yeah, so I am political director of George Mason University Democrats, and we are out here to help engage students, help them come to the polls, make sure that they have an informed decision, and make sure that they're able to utilize their right to vote.
And what are you looking to see today for a successful turnout?
I think a successful turnout today would be seeing a broad array of students from all backgrounds, of all stripes, of all majors, coming out to vote, to engage with their community, to engage in their civic duty. I think obviously like a high turnout would be like more people coming out than 2020, more people coming out than 2021. But I think at a politically engaged campus like Mason, I think a high turnout means just getting as many students out here as humanly possible to make their voice heard.
And why should students vote for the Democrats?
I think students should vote for the Democrats because Democrats consistently have the backs of students. Democrats have absolved $15,000 of student loan debt for college students, for the vast majority of college students in the United States. Democrats consistently fight for better healthcare access, making sure that all people, no matter their socioeconomic background, can access healthcare. Democrats stand for strong K-12 funding to make sure that students are prepared to go to colleges and universities. Democrats support queer rights. Democrats support abortion rights. Democrats support the things that young people are fighting for. And Democrats also stand for peace, also stand for a world without endless conflict, for a world where we don't have to be sent off to fight for conflict, and rather we can turn towards diplomacy and turn towards fighting for a world where everyone's equal and fighting for a world where everyone has a fair shot.
And what should students be doing to engage after they vote?
I think after students vote, students need to go online and they need to find the resources in their community that they can use to help. That starts with volunteering, obviously. That starts with getting involved in your community at like the base level, volunteering, helping people. I think also 2024 is fast approaching, and in Virginia, 2023 is also a very important election year. I think if you are passionate about a specific political issue, be it immigration, queer rights, abortion rights, anything, get involved. There is a state delegate candidate, there's a state Senate candidate, there's a congressional candidate, there's going to be a future presidential primary candidate who stands for what you believe in, and be the change you want to see in the world. If you want to see a specific policy enacted, go out there and fight for it. I think that everyone who goes to the school is incredibly blessed with a bunch of opportunities that DC provides us, and I think it's very easy to take hold. You just got to sit down, do your research, and be prepared to get in the fight for the future of the country.
All right, any final thoughts for students today?
I think students just need to always remember to trust democratic institutions. Our democracy has been here for us over the last 220, 230, 240 years. I think students need to continue to get involved in democratic processes because it does change things. Students got Barack Obama elected in 2008 and brought a wave of change from Obamacare to gay marriage. Students elected Joe Biden in 2020 and fought off the divisiveness of Donald Trump. And students just need to keep getting politically involved, because whenever we keep getting politically involved, older generations, other generations, they don't have a monopoly. They don't hold a monopoly of power in that case.
Would you mind telling us why you're out here today and why student government's out here today?
Yeah, so I am the Undersecretary for State and Local Affairs and Student Government, and that falls under the Government and Community Relations Department. And all month we've been doing voter engagement events such as tabling on National Voter Registration Day, and we hosted First of All We Vote, which was a debate or Q&A with candidates of the 11th District. And now we're out here today giving Starbucks coffee and cookies to students who show us that they voted. We believe that civic engagement is so important, especially among young people. So we want to make sure students are excited to vote, ready to vote, and become informed voters.
Awesome. And what do you think a successful day would look like today in terms of how students are voting or whether students are voting or not?
Yeah, so increased voter turnout is our biggest goal. As long as students are, excited to vote, that's our biggest thing. And we think with same-day voter registration that Virginia has started this year, we will hopefully see an increase because a lot of students just don't know how to register to vote with their campus address or don't know that they need to update it if they've moved each year. So I think same-day voter registration is really going to help and increase that turnout.
Awesome. And what do you think students should be doing after they vote today or in the future or far in the future, I guess?
Yeah, I think voting becomes a habit. It's shown that people who vote once will vote again. So just making sure it's a habit, making sure you're being an informed voter, researching, and then holding these politicians accountable. If you voted for a candidate and you feel like they're not holding up their end of the bargain, then it's important to tell them that. And we hope to see people get more involved through volunteering, through anything like that. So.
Awesome. Oh. And do you have any final thoughts for everybody listening in today?
Keep making a plan to vote. Each year, decide how you're voting, whether that's mail-in ballot, early day, absentee ballot, or on election day. It's important to make sure you have a plan.
Okay, so why are you voting today?
I'm voting because I think it's really important to use your voice, and I feel like I'm making my family proud, feel like I'm making my friends proud, and I feel proud to have voted.
I love that. Are there any issues in particular?
Mainly abortion and LGBTQ issues.
Okay. What do you want to see more from Mason in regards to voting?
I think they're doing a great job just continuing to encourage students to vote. I feel like all my professors have encouraged me to vote. Just keeping it up, I think, is really important.
What brings you out here today?
Well, I am a civic student advocate, and I am here to see that Mason votes and to help out.
And what does that role entail?
Basically, my job has been like making resources for students like vote, like getting together like the candidates and like putting together little infographics on like their views, like how to vote if you're like in the Virginia, Maryland, DC area, like the dates, like when you should sign up for voting and all of that stuff.
And what is your role here today?
Well, I am here with Mason Votes, and we are here to like make sure people know where they're going to vote and like to have a survey on like why they chose to or not to vote, and then to give out like stickers and pins and stuff for voting.
And why should students come vote today?
Because our voices are important, and a lot of, especially this year with such as like Roe v. Wade being overturned, the book bans are trying to pass and stuff, like your opinions on these things matter, and if you don't share your opinion, there might be laws and stuff put in place that don't reflect your views or our views as a whole.
All right, thank you. Do you have a final parting shot?
Go vote.
This election has also seen a fair amount of fear from poll workers and election workers generally across this country. Our news director, Jack, had a chance to sit down with a Mason student who was working as a poll worker this year. Let's take a look at that as well.
Hi, I'm Jack. I'm the news director here. I'm here with Allison. She was a poll worker during the 2020 election, is that correct?
It is, yes.
Can you explain what you did as a poll worker?
Yeah, absolutely. So I actually didn't get the idea from myself. I got it from an older woman I'd worked with, and she had said that the county needed more Democrats to run polls because you need an equal number of Republicans, Democrats helping run the polls. So I went to a training, and I was the only young person there. Everyone else was older. And they trained me to basically what I did was, because it was during the pandemic, I had to take a sanitizing wipe and I sanitized every single person's ID that they would hand me, and I would scan it through this iPad system. And the iPad would show me whether they are registered to vote and if they were in the correct precinct and what they are registered as. And then I'd direct them over to another group of people who would hand them their ballot and give them the rundown on where to sit and how to use their ballot.
Okay, did you have? So I assume you didn't really have to deal with any serious issues as far as poll workers dealt with?
Because it was the pandemic, it was a little tricky than what people had told me before. I'd never had a previous experience aside from the pandemic, but the added sanitizing was different. So several people did get kind of upset that I was sanitizing their IDs, and they would tell me I'm not sick, and I would have to be like, it doesn't really matter. I have to sanitize everyone's ID. You'd also run into issues when someone would be at the wrong precinct, because my county had 4 or 5 precincts, and maybe they came to one that wasn't their correct precinct where they were supposed to vote at. And so I'd have to tell them, you're not registered to vote here, you're registered to vote at or you're registered to vote, but you can't vote here. You need to go to this hall instead, or this church to vote instead. And they would get kind of upset that they couldn't vote. So I'd run into those kinds of things like that.
And you had mentioned, what state were you doing this in?
This was in Ohio. This was in Ashland, Ohio.
And that's, where is that in Ohio?
So that is about halfway between Cleveland and Columbus. I'd say it's an hour from each city. So it's right kind of northeast Ohio.
So it's like kind of, if Columbus is here, Cleveland is there, it's like here.
Exactly.
That's neat. What was your favorite part about being a poll worker?
Connecting with some of the other people, actually, because everyone got a lunch break, and I got a lunch break with some older people who were also Democrats and were very interested as to see like why I had done this in the first place. And they had worked several polls previously and kind of talked about why they enjoy it so much and why they enjoy volunteering for your community. And so it was just cool to talk to other people who had had these experiences before me.
And you only worked on election day?
I only worked on election day, yes. We had to get there at 5 a.m. And stayed till 8 or 9
p.m. Oh, yeah, that was going to be my next question. So did results start coming in? I assume they started coming in by the time you left?
No, that was the tricky thing. Because of the pandemic, so many people had voted with mail, and not all the mail ballots had been done yet or counted yet. So no, results didn't come in for a few more days. But the main reason everyone came to vote was for the presidency election. A lot of people didn't care about the smaller county races or things like that. It was mainly for presidential. I guess, actually, I'm remembering one of the other issues we ran into. We had a lot of people that came in Trump attire, and we'd have to tell them you can't wear any kind of political or campaign merch within 100 yards of within the precinct. So we had to give everyone had to wear a mask inside. So I guess that was another issue. People would be upset about the mask, and then we had people coming and wearing Trump masks. So that was another thing that had to be addressed.
And my final question is, would you ever do this again?
I think I would, but not in Ohio. I plan to move. I mean, you can't work for the polls unless you're registered to vote in that state. So I couldn't work for the polls here. I'm still registered to vote in Ohio. I do plan to move to Virginia, so I'd be maybe more open to working the polls here, and maybe not during a pandemic.
Of course. Yeah. And thank you so much for coming to interview. We hope you enjoyed our discussion.
All right. That was an amazing piece. And again, we've seen in this election, unlike in most elections, a hesitancy from many Americans who would traditionally work in elections from doing so, and poll workers from actively participating. So hearing from somebody in our own college community in the 11th District of Virginia, where during the 2020 election we saw supporters of the former president blocking people's paths getting into precincts. It's incredible to see someone with that kind of dedication. And speaking of which, we're seeing across the country tonight that there are plenty of candidates that are election deniers from 2020. The majority of Republican candidates so far this election have been those types of candidates, but we're seeing a lot more victory, in particular from Republican candidates who buck that trend.
Yeah.
Brian Kemp is currently holding an 8-point lead in his run for governor in Georgia. And we're seeing at the same time, Doug Mastriano is losing by about the same margin to Josh Shapiro in Pennsylvania. What do you think attributes to that? What do you think that says about the way that Americans expect their elections to run regardless of their political party?
Yeah. Well, this cycle, I believe, tends to favor more moderates in this case, which is why we're probably seeing the moderate candidates possibly they're more competitive candidates, in short. And I think also an interesting perspective on this as well is Democratic influence. Because way back during the primary season, Dems funded candidates who were more extreme compared to like the other elements of the party who were more like moderates, right? So I think that's also an interesting angle too, seeing how Dems have possibly swung certain districts in their favor by funding like the more extreme candidates.
Absolutely, and just so that we're clear on what that means, when a Democratic arm or a Democratic campaign arm is funding a candidate of this type. They're not sending money directly to their campaigns, just so we're saying that. It's that they put out advertisements that seem or that are intended to be negative, but seem to play a positive effect with a base that they hope will turn out in a primary to keep a candidate that would otherwise be more competitive out of that race. But we've seen that trend, despite being helpful in this case, has traditionally not worked. So what is the difference with election denial and, let's say, being pro-Second Amendment in a way that's out of touch with the community, but still having a message that ends up resonating? Because in most cases, when you see one party funding advertising money for the opposing party, it is effective in the short term, but ineffective in the long term.
Yeah. I mean, well, 2016, Democrats never, did anything with Trump, but like, there's certainly people who were cheering, at least from Democrats, cheering for Trump to win the primary because they thought it would be an easy dunk on Trump. We learned pretty quickly that was not the case. But yeah, I mean, so in terms of long-term strategy, it's very volatile, but for short-term, maybe in this case it might work out, who knows? I mean, what do you think on the matter?
I think, honestly, in this race, it allowed for a lot of seemingly non-competitive Republicans to go into races that generally would be a slam dunk for Democrats. But in these last few weeks leading up, in the last few months of inflation, in the last year of Democrats having a very strong message on COVID-19, but at the same time perhaps taking that messaging further than Americans were comfortable going, but that doesn't necessarily work. I think we also see that, again, Democrats who started off this campaign on infrastructure, started off this campaign on traditional dinner table, kitchen table issues, and ended it mostly on defense. That Republicans that I would say most Democrats would have thought would never come within 10 city blocks of having the word elect after their title, are going to be there. And the Democrats that they were using that funding to promote are going to be going home. And speaking of which, before we continue, we did want to make clear that Meg Thornberry, who has been our correspondent at each of these victory parties, or now victory parties at that time, watch parties for Democrats, did attempt to join Jim Miles, reached out to his campaign, but Jim Miles is the now non-victorious candidate, Republican candidate for the 11th District of Virginia against Jerry Connolly, was having a private party at his home. You can see the results up now. But Jim Miles having a private party, unable to join that party or speak to him at that time, being why we had a very slanted set of watch parties attended. In the meantime, continuing back to these conversations on election denial, on the candidates who are winning on it, who are losing on it, we are seeing in Georgia, Herschel Walker has pushed ahead, where he was expected, even on a ticket that included Brian Kemp, up until very recently, not to make it nearly this close to victory, with 2/3 of the vote in thus far. That is still narrowing again, but questions still lie as to the geographical placement of those votes, whether they're rural, whether they're in those suburbs that won Joe Biden that general election in 2020, where in Pennsylvania, John Fetterman continues to hold a lead and expand a lead, going from 50.6% to 51.6% in these last few minutes, as we've increased from 1/3 to 41% of the vote coming in. In Wisconsin, thus far, Mandela Barnes is is outperforming the expectations for him against Ron Johnson. And Arizona, we are seeing the first results come in. We are at about 38% of the votes counted. Arizona having a very historically efficient vote counting process, except for in 2020 when we saw the threats in Maricopa County. And even today, the Maricopa County GOP sued to keep election sites open, which is by no means the same at all. It's just an update that there are still votes that we expect to come in throughout the day, throughout this evening, as we hit the 8 p.m. deadline to vote in Arizona. Now we are going to hop over to another package, talking about the issues that we were just talking about other issues regarding this upcoming Congress. Gabe, do you have anything to tell us about that?
Yeah, so Brad Byrne from the Fourth Estate got to actually talk to a communications professor here at George Mason, Professor Hank Silverberg, which we'll be playing the video now.
All right, so today I'm joined by Hank Silverberg, who's a professor here at George Mason University. He teaches the political journalism class here. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Hank has had a great career in the past, working at WTOP and radio for many years, and also at WSA 9. So I just wanted to say thank you here for coming. You've had a lot of experience covering elections. You've covered Capitol Hill before. Just kind of talk to me about how important midterms are to everyone.
Well, they're extremely important. I mean, President Biden has an agenda, and it's going to be extremely difficult for him to get anything done if the House goes Republican. So for the Democrats, it's important that they keep control of both the House and Senate so they can move his agenda forward. For the Republicans, they want to stop his agenda. They need to take control of the House and the Senate. And hopefully in the Senate for them, or in the House, they want to have a veto proof, meaning they'll have more votes vetoed. That's not, I can tell you right now, that's not going to happen. But there's a good possibility that the Republicans will take control of both houses and make things very difficult for President Biden for the next 2 years at least.
Do you think there's a chance that the Democrats could keep both?
Both? I don't know. I personally believe they've got a good shot at keeping the Senate. Pennsylvania and Georgia, as everybody's been saying, are the key. It would have been a shoo-in in Pennsylvania, except for Mr. Fetterman's stroke. A lot of voters are concerned. He did not look too good in his debate. I'm not an expert on medicine, but the experts are saying, that everything's in the head. It just doesn't come out right. So I think some people will be concerned about that. Some people might have voted for him. And then, of course, Mehmet Oz has the TV personality. That's not necessarily make him qualified to be the Senate, but some people, like the idea they know who he is. They think they know who he is by what he did on TV.
Yeah, so I guess speaking more towards races in Virginia, I know you live in the 7th District. 7th. So could you just tell me a little bit about your thoughts on that race?
Things have really changed. When I first moved into the 7th District years ago, Dave Bratt was a Republican incumbent. He had just beaten Eric Cantor, who was among the leadership in the House. A long-time conservative Republican. Everyone was flabbergasted. Bratt basically was a placeholder. He sat there for 2 years and did absolutely nothing. And I'm not being unfair to him. He didn't do a single thing while he was in office. So Spanberger pulled an upset when she beat him 4 years ago. And she was easily reelected 2 years ago. The problem is the 7th has been radically gerrymandered. It should favor Democrats because they moved the district north a little bit into parts of Prince William County and Fredericksburg also, which are more Democratic. But Yelsey Vega also comes from Prince William. She's a supervisor there with a built-in base. And was a police officer. And she's hitting some of the right chords in this race. The one thing she's got all wrong, though, which may come back to bite her, is accusing Spanberger of being a copycat of Nancy Pelosi. She's really not. She's a moderate Democrat who has twice voted against the Speaker to be the Speaker. And she has worked across the aisle. I have to say, since I covered Congress, it's been almost 15 years now, the idea of bipartisanship has gone down the tubes. It does not exist anymore. And I think at times President Biden has trouble with that, because he was in the Senate all those years where he could walk into the Republican leader's office and they could work out a deal and get things done. That is absolutely impossible the way the country is polarized right now.
Yeah, and I think another point that makes the 7th District so interesting is that Vega was endorsed by Trump, but she's kind of starting to veer away from that. Why do you think that is?
Well, Mr. Trump, just yesterday he attacked Ron DeSantis, a likely opponent in the primary. All the speculation is that he's going to announce for president again in 2014. There's a lot of Republicans who have always felt uncomfortable with Donald Trump, and they were hoping he would just go away, but he hasn't. They need him to win the election. They don't need him to run for president again, because he's got carrying a lot of things, okay? And so she wants to be on Trump's side of the issues, but doesn't want to be a Trump. And Ron DeSantis is doing the same thing. And that wing of the party really doesn't want Trump to get too visible.
Yeah, and do you think having Youngkin on her side is going to help her or not, especially with comments that she's made, or that Youngkin has made regarding the attack on Paul Pelosi?
Virginia's governors are lame ducks the minute they take office because they can't run again. And the first question they're always asked is, are you seeking higher office? This is just my opinion, but there's no doubt in my mind that Glenn Youngkin wants higher office. And he's already working on that by traveling around the country, on the taxpayer's dime, I might add, supporting other candidates. He wants to build up some IOUs. He comes in, though, with a pretty good win a year ago and a lot of support among conservatives in Virginia. So I think he helps her more than Trump does. Okay, the question is, Mr. Youngkin's popularity is waning a little bit, all right? It's not, he's still got more approval than disapproval, but it's not as popular as it was before. Some of the things he promised during the campaign have fallen flat. So people are kind of saying, do I really want another Glenn Youngkin? I don't think she's another Glenn Youngkin, but I do think they're on the same side on a lot of issues.
Yeah, and then, going off of your point of higher office, do you think, for the midterms, what do you think the ramifications of these specific midterms will have for the election in 2024?
Well, if the Republicans do take control of the House and the Senate, it's actually going to give Trump a lot less fodder, because Biden won't go anywhere. Nothing he proposed will go anywhere, and he won't have anything to criticize. But he's got a substantial following, and he's got a lot of money. And some of the Republicans who are having trouble raising money are going to owe it to Trump because he helped them out so much. And it's going to help. It all of it depends on who runs against him. I mean, if he gets challenged in a primary, and there's a possibility of DeSantis, Marco Rubio, Youngkin, Lindsey Graham, who's back and forth on Trump, and a few others who very well. But you saw what happened last time. We saw this with Ron what do they call him? Ron Deconsistent or something like that, because he's already attacking potential, which before the midterms was really stupid. Okay, it's very bad to do, because a lot of Republicans who even support Trump even said, Mr. Trump, shut up before the midterms. We don't want to get into internal battles until we win. But he's never listened to that before, so there's no reason why you listen to them now. In case you don't know, I have a very low opinion of Trump, and it's not about his party label, because he's not Ike, he's not Reagan, he's not even George W. Bush. So he helps and he hurts, because there's a lot of people out there who swear by Donald Trump. And if you have his tangible approval, then they're going to take a look at you and they say, okay, well, Trump likes her, so I'll vote for her. And there's still a substantial number of people out there who they go in there and they look for the R and the D, and that's how they make their decision. And that's going to happen again. Look, the key as to who wins, as in many elections, is voter turnout. And Republicans and Democrats don't decide the election. Independents do, always. Okay, so if the independents lead Democrat, especially in the 7th district, Spanberger wins again. If the independents leave Republican, then I think Yelsey has got a chance. All right, a pretty good chance. I don't trust polls anymore either. So you'll see a lot of polls. They were proven wrong 2 years ago and 4 years ago because so many people, they lie. The pollster will ask them, well, you vote for a Democrat or Republican. They're really a diehard Democrat, but they'll say, well, I haven't decided yet, because they want to throw the poll off, or vice versa, because they think it somehow influences the election. The only poll that matters is the one at the ballot box. And I tell you, I know a lot of other people, they'll have predictions, they'll go by statistics, but they're shooting in the dark on this one, really. I'm shooting in the dark like everybody else. It's so different than it was just 5 years ago, I remember in the Cuccinelli-McAuliffe race, which was the last governor's race I covered, it was pretty obvious to most of us who covered the election that Cuccinelli had absolutely no chance of winning. All right, and I remember early on, I just told this story in class. Early on, we were getting the votes in from southwestern Virginia, and that's Republican country, and Cuccinelli was winning, and everybody was going, oh my God, it's going to be an upset. And I just turned to him and I said, look, wait until Fairfax County votes. See what happens in Fairfax County, which still is pretty much dominated by Democratic politics, although less blue than in the past, okay? But there are 1 million votes up here, all right? So what they do in Goochland is not going to have that much what they do in Fairfax. So look for where the votes are coming from. And then the thing you got to watch in this election is early vote dumps. In some states, and I don't really know what the rules are in Virginia, but in some states where they had early voting, they're allowed to count the votes as soon as the early voting ends. And most of them end a day or two before Election Day, so they can restructure everything, right? They can count them, but they can't release them, the votes, until the polls are closed on Election Day. So you might see at 10 after 8, 15,000 people have voted in such and such an area, and the Republicans leading 2-1. Yeah. All right. But Republicans tend to vote by mail more than Democrats. Democrats tend to vote early more than Republicans. So you have to look at what those votes are. Are these votes by mail? Are these votes early? Okay. So then everybody says, oh, it looks like it's a Republican victory. And then the votes come in from the big city or the college town and completely turn it around. All right. And that's what happened in the last election, why the Republicans were screaming fraud, because they did not understand that the votes aren't counted 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. They're counted in clumps and put into the results in clumps. We used to joke every year, even in the old days, that every year there's some county clerk in some little county somewhere who finishes counting the 300 votes they got at 20 after 8, puts them in a closet and goes home for the night. And it turns out that at the end of the night, the election is so close that those 300 votes really matter. Okay? And that happens every election. And that's liable to happen again somewhere. And that's where you get all these false accusations of fraud. It's part of the way is the way we vote these days too. It used to be you went in, you pushed a little lever, it got recorded on the machine. The machine would give you a printout of what the votes were, and it was easy to tabulate. Now, every different place you go, they're different. We used to have the ones where you push button, okay, and it would all be stored in the machine. They were worried about tampering, so then they got the machines where you push the button, but it makes a paper record. I voted early, and it's you make your mark on the paper and you slip it in the paper and the machine records it, but they keep the paper ballot as a record. So if the machine gets broken, they'll have it. That's the trend. And I think the election technology has improved a lot, even in the last 2 years. So hopefully we'll get fewer reports. Another thing I can guarantee you, in any election that is within 3 or 4%, if the Republican is on the low end, there will be a challenge. And they'll scream fraud. There right now are 291 people, according to the count by the Washington Post. Let's credit them. 291 people on the federal Republican ballot who are election deniers, meaning they deny the results of the 2020 election. How many of them you think, if they lose, are going to scream fraud? Okay, so let's watch for this after the election. I think we're going to be more interesting after Election Day. And then the turnout on Election Day is always interesting. Yeah. Especially in a state like Virginia where you don't have a statewide race. In Maryland, you got the governor's race, but it's a Democratic state. So then the only question is, Governor Moore get the same votes that Chris Van Hollen gets, all right? In Virginia, we don't have a statewide race. Youngkin's not on, our 2 senators overlapping terms. So the 6th district is really, the 7th district really is the only one that really matters. I mean, Morgan Griffin is running practically uncontested. You do have Wexton, and I forget who her opponent is. Mr. Cow? Yeah. Okay. That might be an interesting race, only because that's a kind of still a purple district. Next question.
Well, that's actually all I have for you, but thank you so much for giving us our great expertise and everything you've accomplished throughout your career, and hopefully you're having a great day tomorrow when the
If I'm all wrong, you can tease me in class.
All right. Well, this is Hank Silverberg, everyone. Thank you, and we're out.
Thank you for that piece, and thank you to Professor Silverberg for joining us, as well as Professor Victor, who joined us earlier. Right now, we're looking at districts across the country and Senate races across the country. Colorado, where Michael Bennet was running against a Republican challenger, Mr. O'Day, who seemed to be outperforming most Republicans in the area. A pro-choice Republican, a relatively moderate Republican on guns, if memory serves. Mr. O'Day was expected to put up a relatively strong fight against Michael Bennet, Senator Bennet, who was still expected to win, but certainly in more contention than had been the case previously. Senator Bennet now holding that seat. Senator Kelly from Arizona also standing in the way of a challenge from Blake Masters, a very Trump-aligned Republican who has been running on election denial, who has been running on a lot of very recent MAGA policies, and seeing that that is not working quite so well in that race, despite a relatively strong turnout for Kari Lake thus far. A former local news anchor running against Katie Hobbs, the Secretary of State, the current Secretary of State outgoing, and nominee for the Democratic ticket for governor in Arizona. What races are you looking at right now, Gabe?
So specifically, to bring it back to Colorado, in the Colorado 3rd District, Lauren Boebert and Adam Frisch are going head-to-head with Adam Frisch, currently at 53% of the vote. There's currently a 63% reporting in total, but 53 to Boebert's 47 are not good odds, especially as we're encroaching on that 70%, which is particularly interesting because a lot of the media, no one really has focused on this specific election and on Boebert as a whole. People tend to look at Marjorie Taylor Greene's Georgia election as a sort of more of a competitive seat, but we're seeing that there with Marcus Flowers and Marjorie Taylor Greene that there's a huge difference between the two of them. It's something like it's 66 to 34 with 82% reporting in. So it's a blowout, to be honest, with Marcus Flowers. So it's interesting to see that sort of difference between MTG and Boebert, and that a lot of people have focused on this election.
Absolutely, and Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, a district that is traditionally Republican, where her previous opponent had to drop out of the race and, in fact, moved out of the state altogether, given the number of threats that he was getting. To now have, after an uncontested race in the 2020 election, now in the 2022 election, in this rural Georgia county, a county which has had a history of discrimination, seeing a person of color running against Marjorie Taylor Greene and making it through to the end in a way that her previous opponent did not, a man who has served in the military as well. Is actually, I wouldn't say a shock, it shouldn't be a shock, but in the current climate and with the current candidates, certainly not entirely expected.
Yeah.
No one expected Marcus Flowers to win, but given the violence and the conspiracy and the conspiratorial nature of that violence in Marjorie Taylor Greene's first election, I don't think anybody would have expected a Marcus Flowers to make it this far. I don't think anybody would certainly be saying that Marcus Flowers would even win the 33% that he's won in this district thus far, seeing as traditionally this is a Republican district by a 50-point margin. This is not to say that by any means this is turning into a swing district, but it's certainly saying that in this climate, in a climate that is this extreme, particularly in this rural Georgia county, it's interesting to see a Democrat outperforming previous Democrats, or even in the race at all.
Yeah.
Moving back closer to home, though, and away from Marjorie Taylor Greene's district, Abigail Spanberger, the representative for the 7th District of Virginia, has pulled ahead against Yesli Vega, currently standing at 51 to 49%. We're still watching those results come in. We're at about 99% of the expected vote in, but we'll be watching as that changes. That 99% is not a clear number of how many votes have been cast. It is in fact based on the expectation of voter values, not ideologically so much as the number of expected voters to cast a vote prior to the election. So that can change, including if this race becomes close enough to count on provisional ballots, which we are not there yet. That will only come if we come within a 1% margin with this vote.
Do you want to get spicy? Do you think Spanberger's going to win the district?
I don't know how spicy I'm going to get, as it were. I think Abigail Spanberger is a moderate Democrat who has set herself up as a moderate Democrat and has made the right moves, particularly within a party that appears to the individuals in her district, people who are traditionally more conservative.
Mm-hmm.
She's bucked the party enough to make moves to put herself in the center. I don't believe that her margin will be as strong as it was in 2020. I certainly don't think her margin will be as strong as it was in 2018. But I do see a possibility. I do see a path for her to win her seat back. As it stands, I keep on turning back to the 2nd District of Virginia, where Elaine Luria took a massive gamble by joining the January 6th committee, which I wouldn't say per se is a bad decision politically. It has to be played in the correct within the correct context. But Abigail Spanberger certainly played it safe, and her playing it safe, her history as well as a public servant, being a member or being an agent for the Central Intelligence Agency previously, or an analyst for the Central Intelligence Agency previously, her service to this country, all of those things play in her favor in a district, a swing district that traditionally favors the military, traditionally favors the clandestine services for members of Congress there, or people who have done service in some other form, particularly Democrats. We see a traditional take within the Democratic Party of in-swing districts using individuals who have been a member of the military community or an adjacent community to run in those districts, because having that background plays with independents and Republicans more and more consistently than they do in traditionally Democratic areas. I think we're hitting on Virginia well enough, and I think we should bring it maybe even closer to home for what will likely be our last package of the night, where our news director, Jack Dunn, did go to an event for Congressman Jerry Connolly, who won his race tonight. In fact, thus far, Democrats have pretty consistently held on to all of their seats, or non-incumbents have taken, non-incumbent Democrats have also taken seats that were held by democratically, what's the word I'm looking for?
Elected?
Democratically elected, but well, yes, all of us all of us have democratically elected mayors here. We're not pretending that this is a fully Republican system. No, I mean democratically endorsed candidates, as David Myers, the very reputable mayor of Fairfax City, is heading out of office, and Catherine Reed is entering office. We've seen a good showing for Democrats in Northern Virginia. But let's check out that event that Jack was at just before this election happened, where we saw a very good turnout for Democrats again here in Northern Virginia, and we will see what the results look like across the rest of Virginia. Once again, 2nd District of Virginia, Elaine Luria running about 10 points behind. Abigail Spanberger pulling ahead in the 7th District. Those were the two main swing districts. And in the 10th District, Jennifer Wexton apparently holding on to her seat. But let's take a look at this event.
My name is Jack Dunn. I am the news director of Mason Cable Network. On Friday, I attended an event with Representative Jerry Connolly. He is a 7-term United States representative from Virginia's 11th District, which includes George Mason University. He's running for his 8th term in November. I attended the Democracy Lab event that was put on by the Schar School at George Mason University. When he was there, he explained how things run in Congress, what some of his favorite events are, and afterwards we got to ask questions. Some people asked questions about what how he thought the elections might end up going.
And they elected me by a margin of 44,000 votes against the same opponent in 2008. 2 years later, the people who were enthusiastic about all of that didn't vote. I mean, that was a turnout. That was a collapse of turnout on our part. The election we're about to have Tuesday is not going to be a turnout collapse.
And some people even asked questions about when they could expect results, since we know this is probably going to be a long night of elections. At the end of the event, Representative Connolly thanked everyone for their questions, and he hopes that you all vote on Tuesday, just like I do.
All right, as we begin winding down for the night, do you want to start talking about the
gubernatorial race in New York?
Yeah.
Absolutely. In New York, we've seen a number of races that have gotten closer. In the House, Sean Patrick Maloney, who is the chairman of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, in the governor's mansion, Kathy Hochul, who replaced Andrew Cuomo after a series of scandals last year, was running a lot closer with her opponent, Lee Zeldin, a congressman from Long Island. These races are not traditionally this competitive.
Yeah.
I mean, it's very difficult to understand how they get to this point. And so looking at a Lee Zeldin running against Kathy Hochul, Kathy Hochul was someone who ran in the lieutenant governor's race with Andrew Cuomo by going to each and every county in New York. She visited every county and spoke to people in each county. She ran a very localized campaign. It was not a national campaign in the same way that you would expect someone like Andrew Cuomo, who was the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under the Clinton administration, who had a very national profile to begin with, whose father was governor of that state, and frankly, whose brother, as a lead anchor on CNN prior to his departure with his involvement in these scandals regarding sexual misconduct, just to be clear, helped in boosting his profile, particularly during the pandemic. Kathy Hochul did a very good job of keeping herself outside of that.
Yeah, for sure.
and after she came into the governorship, she turned a new leaf, particularly as the first female governor of New York. She's the first woman to hold that seat. I believe she was also the first woman to hold the lieutenant governorship up until that point, if I'm not mistaken. And to see her, who had a very high approval following Cuomo's exit and his resignation, which very nearly turned into an impeachment.
Yeah.
That soft and smooth transition into Kathy Hochul left Democrats with a lot of confidence. But with crime going the way that it has in New York City, crime going the way that it has across the state of New York, and the discussion that's occurred around that, around kitchen tables, it created a very tense situation for her candidacy. And I think that leads me to kind of ask you a question in this case, which is, you know, a governorship is so much more than crime. And I understand the crime situation in New York has been particularly bad lately. That's not a new phenomenon. We've seen that going on for years, in fact, decades. You know, Rudy Giuliani ran at a very opportune time for mayor of New York when crime was already on a decline, and was able to run on that, and as that continued to trend in that direction, was able to run on it again for a second term as mayor. But in this case, we're seeing not a decline, particularly after COVID-19, an increase in crime, an increase in homelessness, an increase in issues that would be important to a historically blue state. What is it that makes that state immediately run toward a much tighter, perhaps not Republican leaning, perhaps not even Republican likely, or even, you know, it's still a very safe Democratic state. Kathy Hochul will certainly win this election, but by less than most Democrats will.
Yeah.
What leads New York voters, particularly New York Democratic voters, to switch their vote from Hochul to Zeldin?
Crime has, like you mentioned, crime has always been a forefront issue in New York politics. That's something that's not new. But in this case, I also partially think that the focus on crime is a little overblown, at least nationally speaking. You mentioned that it hasn't really gone up incredibly, at least in New York, but at least nationally, the crime isn't a huge issue. But Republican messaging has especially made this seem like it's an issue. But yeah, at least that's my opinion on the matter. And partially why Zeldin is probably doing so good is because recent messaging from Republicans are really hitting the nail in the coffin for Republicans. But evidently not enough of a nail to let the Republicans win New York. But I mean, your thoughts?
No, absolutely. I agree. You know, and I don't think that this is just a problem in New York. I think this is going to be a problem across the country. We're also looking in Wisconsin at Tony Evers, who's running ahead of Tim Michels, who is a very, very far-right candidate against a Democratic governor who used to be the head of the Board of Education, or not the Board of Education, the head of, I believe it was the provost of Wisconsin Public Schools. And regardless of those politics, it's working in favor of Evers, but Evers, lieutenant governor who's running for Senate, who has downplayed crime to some degree, seems not to be performing as well. Tony Evers is running at 51.6 to Tim Michels' 47.4, with an independent candidate, Joan Ellis Bellinger, running, or Beglinger, apologies, running at about 1%, pulling from Michels' conservative bloc. You know, we see that. We see Dane County. We see Milwaukee County running well. However, up in Brown County, and if we're looking out in Door County, we're not seeing quite the same numbers that we probably would have expected to go in Evers' direction. Brown County being where Green Bay is, Door County being a relatively wealthy Democratic base up in northern Wisconsin, but turnout being even worse for Mandela Barnes, who is currently losing in Door, is barely holding on to a lead in Brown, but is holding on to Milwaukee and Door counties pretty strongly. We'll see what that turns out to be. But in the same way that Lee Zeldin and Kathy Hochul are having problems, Mandela Barnes, someone who was initially seen as a very good candidate as a lieutenant governor, as a very popular lieutenant governor, particularly after the protests last year regarding George Floyd's death, or 2 years ago, apologies now, particularly after the protests in Racine County with Kyle Rittenhouse's infamous shooting of two protesters there. There was a lot of that racial tension that fell onto Mandela Barnes' shoulders that I think he held himself up well. You know, it's never easy to be the spokesman for a community, and Mandela Barnes did that very well. Yeah. And walking into this election, Ron Johnson was the second least liked Republican in the country. He was considered the most vulnerable person with a seat up this election. The only senator who had a lower approval rating was Mitch McConnell at 12%, as opposed to Ron Johnson's 20% approval, and even in his own state had less than a 35% approval rating at that point. And it seems like right now split tickets are going to be holding this up, where Mandela Barnes continues to hold right around 50%, and Tony Evers continues to hold about a point ahead, a point and a half ahead. And across the country, this is still going to be a problem. Steve Sisolak in Nevada is running on a lot of the same issues, as there is an increase in crime in Las Vegas, as there is an increase in homelessness in Las Vegas. We're not going to see the end of this. We're not going to see the end of these races tonight. We're not going to be seeing the end of these races, in some cases, for weeks, especially in situations where there's ranked choice voting, especially in situations like in Alaska, where Mary Peltola is running against Sarah Palin and Nick Begich. Nick Begich being the grandson of the first Nick Begich, who was both the congressperson from Alaska, the last Democratic congressperson before Mary Peltola in Alaska, and also the governor of Alaska. We're going to see these things play out over a very long period in some cases. We're also going to see that these issues are not going away. They will play into 2024. And in fact, just as we're hopping into this next election, they're going to play here in Fairfax County for the Board of Supervisors. They're going to play in Virginia for the General Assembly elections. And I don't know what that looks like. I don't know that any of us know what that looks like. I mean, I'd certainly like to know what you think, because right now we're in the midterm for Joe Biden, but next year we're going to be in the midterm for Glenn Youngkin. And Glenn Youngkin is a man with presidential aspirations. So what are your thoughts? I'd really like to know, particularly bringing it back home for the end of our broadcast, because it's very important that we figure this out. We're going to be back here on air in 1 year talking about the General Assembly. What does that look like to you?
Well, it's very hard to predict, like you said. I mean, that's just a common phrase we're kind of going for this broadcast. But it really depends on what this election is going to turn out to be, how the national scene changes. Will it sort of, if the Democrats can manage to hold on to at least some power in the Congress, can inflation go down? That's probably the big issue that's going to probably stick for a while. Can inflation go down? If it can't, what does that look like for local domestic politics? Can we expect that Youngkin to pull out another governor? Well, wait, no, yeah.
He can't run for a second term as governor. We saw this actually exactly a year ago. Yeah. Terry McAuliffe was our former governor. His lieutenant governor, Ralph Northam, ran and won for a seat. And then this is probably a terrible example, but in the same way that the Russian presidential elections work, our state Virginia elections work, which is to say that a governor cannot run for a second term consecutively. They can switch their office within the Commonwealth of Virginia and then come back 4 years later, but they cannot run back-to-back terms.
How about this? Do you think, because Youngkin has he's been very supportive of certain Republican candidates within Virginia. Like he threw his support for the local Fairfax candidate for the Republicans here, or I guess nonpartisan.
Sang Yi, an independent who is now who has now lost his election, but who seemed to have a very good standing earlier on in this election, was not a Republican candidate. He was an independent, much in the way that many Republican-aligned candidates run here in Northern Virginia. But yes, he was an independent candidate who Glenn Youngkin did endorse.
Yeah, but my point is, do you expect to see maybe Youngkin appointing like a successor, maybe if there's support behind, and then potentially in the future either running for president or maybe just returning back to Virginia politics?
And that's a great question. I don't know what a Glenn Youngkin prodigy would be. He's had a very short stint in politics. In fact, some might say that his run for the presidency is ill-advised because, including his lieutenant governor, who ran a much further to the right campaign than he did, I don't know that Glenn Youngkin has a prodigy to put forward, and that Youngkinite politics, as it were, can survive. He was a candidate of the moment. I don't think that he and Winsome Sears will see eye to eye on a lot, particularly if she becomes the governor on his exit. And Jason Miyares, who is his attorney general, or not his attorney general, but who was the attorney general and won in his same election, is not. He's not necessarily of the same brand of politics.
Yeah.
They can run adjacent to each other, but they don't run on the same tracks. And so the question, I think, really becomes, if Glenn Youngkin makes this move, which I believe many would say is ill-advised, despite his popularity in this state, which has fluctuated but seems to have stabilized. If Glenn Youngkin runs, if Glenn Youngkin makes his way forward as a presidential candidate, he risks losing a Virginia that he just created a winning strategy for.
Exactly.
And I don't know in this climate that that's something that national Republicans will forgive him for. In the same way that national Republicans never particularly forgave Marco Rubio for trying to run for president in 2016. Marco Rubio was incredibly young. Glenn Youngkin, not as young as Marco Rubio, but certainly a young political life.
Yeah.
And I don't know that survives bucking the party in a way that puts him in contention for the presidency against Donald Trump, who will likely announce his run next week, Ron DeSantis, who expects to announce his run next week, Larry Hogan, who is still trying to figure out his place in the 2024 primary, against Liz Cheney, who expects to run as a counterweight to Donald Trump, not necessarily to win, but just to have the voice there. And a number of other Republicans, just like there are a number of Democrats trying to figure out whether they're running in an open primary in 2024. We don't know what these things look like, obviously, but at the end of the day, either we create a new way forward in Virginia starting next year, and I don't mean that in a partisan sense, I mean that in a sense of our politics will have to stabilize, or we're going to be seeing a lot more of the national conversation, which has included a lot of this divisive nature on a local level. I don't know what happens after tonight either. I can probably say with limited certainty that Tony Evers will hold on to his seat. I will say that Democrats' historic problem on messaging will continue, and Mandela Barnes, who ran a very historically Democratic conversation on politics, will probably lose, and it will be because He was not ready to buck the party where he needed to. He was not ready to distance himself where he needed to in a state that is very purple right now and that didn't used to be. I think here in Virginia, we're seeing a lot of the same. I think we don't know who's running for governor in 4 years. I think Democrats in Virginia have had a terrible time with messaging, but also a terrible time with politics. We have gone through a minority leader who was the first female speaker of the Virginia House of Delegates in the last year. We've lost, or not we, but they have lost a majority. Right now, there's a minority leader in the Virginia House of Delegates who is relatively new comparatively, and who, as far as it has been seen, does not have the same fundraising advantage that Eileen Filler-Corn, who represents the area around George Mason, had beforehand. I don't know. But I also want to know what you think about this future. I want to know, you've given Virginia, but what does it look like to you on a national level? And what does that national level affect, how does that national level affect Virginia, including Northern Virginia, which is an expanding area?
Yeah. Oh, at least for Northern Virginia, it's probably safe. It's safe to say it's solidly Democrat. I don't see any sort of major national changes that might change that. It's just, in this case, I think it's just a stronghold. It's just not going to move for it. Where the margins are really going to move are sort of leaving outside DC. A lot of these more suburbs of DC, I guess. And you could argue maybe Northern Virginia is like a just one big suburb of DC and all that stuff. But I mean, the outside portions of this, so like the suburbs, yeah. But regardless, yeah. I think Virginia, in its place nationally, is very contentious. But I do think it's probably going to lean Democrat in the future, short and long term. But yeah, I mean, cool, yeah. Anyways,
I completely agree. And honestly, we have not spoken nearly enough beyond Northern Virginia. We need to talk about international politics. We need to talk about any number of things. But for now, for this conversation, we're coming near the end, and we're going to go and check out how Mason voted today. We have our exit polling. We're going to take a look demographically. We're going to take a look by issue. We're going to take a look by party as it stands. Let's see what we have from our first Mason Votes poll today. And the first one is about sex. What is the sex? What is the gender with which the individual who was voting identified? Today, 50% were female. Female voters took the day with exactly half, where 44.6% were male. Apologies, I'm looking at the last little bit here. About 4.5%
point is,
said that they were other, or another 1% said that they were not willing to say. But that's a strong showing, particularly after the Dobbs case in July.
Yeah. Well, I mean, George Mason and most universities just tend to have more like women. Women just tend to be in university more than men are nowadays. And that's just like a trend that we've been seeing recently.
Yeah, and I would agree with that entirely. I mean, the other thing that I will say, though, is Mason's polling place is not just for Mason students. This includes people from the county of Fairfax. This includes people, I believe, as well from the city of Fairfax, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah.
So we're looking at this 50%, including both people who are attending Mason, people who are not attending Mason. That's a fair number of people. I mean, of course, the majority of people who will be voting in this precinct will be people from Mason, as you can see on your screen right now, with that 46.7% between the ages of 18 and 19. Over that, 20 to 21 was just under a quarter. I mean, yes, majority of people voting here are going to be students.
Yeah.
But I do also we also need to point out, Mason's precinct is not just Mason students. The majority of people who will answer this poll will be Mason students. But just so that we're clear, this exit poll will mostly reflect us. It will not necessarily reflect the community, but this is a very large precinct.
Yeah, and to kind of go further, add on to that, as you can see currently, this 18 to 19 age range is mostly consists of freshman and sophomore. Sort of, it correlates perfectly with the age over like year level, with sophomores and freshmen being the half.
Being just over half, being about 51%, 51.1%, and that's true. And you know, just so we say it, we don't have subpoena power, so we can't force people to take this poll. But of our community here at Mason, that's not even plurality. That's a majority of underclassmen outweighing upperclassmen, outweighing graduate students, outweighing community members. At least as far as our exit polling can tell.
Yeah, which is something which is surprising, because you would imagine that the most, as we talked about earlier, the most unreliable group tend to be young voters. But in this case, it seems like they're coming out in full force.
Absolutely, especially in a community school like George Mason.
Yeah.
Which tends to be more commuter, which tends to be not on campus. We are going to see a lot more of these students staying here. Now, we also asked about enthusiasm in this election. We had, I'm sorry, I'm trying to read this. We had also a majority of students who said just over 60%, almost 61% of students saying that they were either very enthusiastic or somewhat enthusiastic about this election. Even when you bring in neutrality about this election, we're talking upwards of 90%. There was not very much at all of not enthusiastic or not enthusiastic at all about this election. And if I'm being quite honest, if we're talking about people who are not enthusiastic or not enthusiastic at all, these are people who still voted for the most part. Because the number of people who did not vote was certainly lower than, if we look at this, I think I'm thinking about a different one of our exits. But that's about even with the neutral to very enthusiastic. We're looking at about even with vote did not vote.
I do want to make a point though, that kind of like a point. With how the exit poll was conducted, we were stationed outside a polling station, and we just generally asked, "Hey, would you be interested in doing an exit polling?" So in terms of enthusiasm, there might be some sample bias, some bias sampling there, and that the people who might have not put not enthused would have just avoided the exit poll as a whole, if that makes sense.
Absolutely.
So just want to stipulate that one fact that might affect that. It's one specific sample of data.
Yeah, I mean, and that's true. But we were also, I'm just thinking out loud. We're also talking about people who are coming out of the building, not so much going into the building. So we're talking about people who would, by and large, have voted on their way out. So even if they weren't enthusiastic, even if that was the case, they weren't enthusiastic, and most likely they voted, or they were neutral, and most likely they voted. I would say that's still, especially in an election like this, especially in an election with as many consequences as it has here, not necessarily in Northern Virginia, but with an idea of how other college campuses might have voted, we're looking at something that is not insignificant. Now, something that is more something that is less indicative of how people vote, more indicative of how we completed this exit polling. How did you cast your vote? As you said, we were outside the building. We were talking to people very directly. So about 72.4% of people cast their vote in person. Cast their
not
vote.
Surprising. It's not surprising.
So it's not surprising that we have that number, but that is very different from the number of people, just so that we're clear, who overall will cast their vote by mail, cast their vote early in person, will cast their vote absentee, and in person, depending on the precinct that they're in, depending on the state that they're in. All of these things are variables. But this 72.4% is very indicative of the people who passed by and did our exit polling, not so much on the way that people overall voted. We do have out-of-state students who obviously could not vote at the precinct here at Mason. We also have people who are from across the Commonwealth of Virginia. This is the most diverse school in Virginia. It is by and large a majority commuter school. But it is at the same time a state school that many people from across this Commonwealth go to.
Also,
I'm not going to pretend to be able to read that one. I'm going to try.
Yeah, but also of importance, 11%, I believe 11% of the population are international students as well. So that also kind of also factors in to some aspects there. But yeah, I mean, so this next point is on the top issues that influence people to vote.
And we did discuss this.
Yeah.
So what was the top issue that brought people to vote?
Abortion.
Abortion.
Abortion is the #1 pick. As you can see, it almost makes up about 25%, almost about a quarter of the total vote share.
And if you add in women's issues, which is the second one, which I suppose a lot of people would call those redundant, but women's issues go beyond abortion. But when you ask that question, generally, it's included in there. You'll usually see it included with women's health and women's issues. In this case, they were separate. But if you include women's issues along with abortion, which is very much, particularly for women voters, a health care issue, you see that we're reaching about a third of voters here at our precinct voted based on a women's issue or a women's health issue when you put together abortion with women's issues. COVID-19, oddly enough, made a pretty big dent in that as well, so healthcare generally.
Well, on those 2 points, the first point, I mean, it makes sense because half of the voters were women. So at least to me it makes sense why abortion and women's issues are up there because
Absolutely.
I mean,
no, absolutely. But at the same time, look at this in a different way. We had 50% of our voting bloc as women. Only about 32% of our voting bloc was voting on abortion or women's issues.
Yeah.
That's a whole 18% that's not accounted for on that, particularly on a college campus, particularly on a college campus that voted over 70% Democratic. That means that for about, not about half, but about 40% of the women who voted, we're looking at a situation where the Dobbs issue was not top of mind.
Yeah.
The Dobbs decision was not at the front of their mind when they were at the ballot box, which is not what which is not to disqualify that 33% is a high number, but that's certainly a plurality across women's issues on campus. But that means that about 40% were not where Democrats expected them to be today.
Yeah.
At a college campus.
Exactly. Yeah.
Their best case scenario.
Yeah.
So I don't know exactly. I may sound like a doomsdayer for Democrats, which to some degree, this map right now is not looking terribly promising. It's not looking necessarily as bad thus far as people would have expected, but we're very early on. There is absolutely no chance of saying that this is absolutely going to be the best case scenario that Democrats were expecting, because it's not. But on a college campus, in a demographic that traditionally votes close to 80% Democratic, because we're talking about a 78% spread for Democrats today, and about a 77% Democratic spread for today, and that voted for Jerry Connolly at a 67% spread. We don't need to go back to that graphic. I saw that one. I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to skip it. But that voted for Jerry Connolly at a 67% spread. That means the Democrats are not winning as heavily on the issues that they were expecting to as they want or as they need to maintain a majority.
Yeah.
It's not there. So we're going to have to see whether they're winning on something else, because if college students aren't there, then I can tell you a mom in the suburbs isn't there.
Yeah.
We're going to have to see what that turns into. And I would love to talk to any Democrat who would like to talk to me about that. But
I'm sure we could talk about this all day.
Yeah, and we could talk about this all day, but we can't.
Yeah.
We can't. One of us is going to fall asleep. But we're past where we were hoping to be tonight as an end spot. I want to thank our crew here for bearing with us as we held on to this a little too long. we're going to be closing out in just a moment, but let's just take one last look at these elections. We're not going to comment on them. We just want to give you the facts as it stands across the country. If you'd like to start, we'll take a look in at some of the key races, and then we'll take a look at the races that exist here in Virginia.
All right, I want to start with North Carolina and Ohio. So currently at North Carolina, there is a 95% votes counted for, with Ted Budd, the Republican, with 51% of the votes, and Cheri Beasley, the Democrat, with 47% of the votes. This is probably going to lean Republican because there's only about 5% of the votes, and Cheri Beasley only has, she has to make up a 4% difference. So that's assuming all the votes go straight to her, which is highly unlikely. So for North Carolina, it probably will be a red seat for them. As for Ohio, we can see J.D. Vance with 54% of the votes. He's the Republican. And then Tim Ryan, the Democrat, with 46% of the vote. And this is with 91% reporting in. So this is also probably going to be a loss for the Democrats with Tim Ryan.
Absolutely.
So those are two races that are just...
Have we seen anything come in, because we've been watching this Democratic race, not necessarily in Ohio, but in Arizona, with Mark Kelly and with Blake Masters. Mark Kelly's been holding ahead pretty frequently, pretty consistently. How are things looking with Kari Lake against Katie Hobbs? Because we've been seeing a fair amount of movement from people who would have otherwise voted for Katie Hobbs moving towards Kari Lake. I'm not sure if we have results for that just yet.
We don't have results for
In the meantime, I do want to bring us back to Virginia for a moment, where we can confidently project that Abigail Spanberger will hold on to her seat. That coming from the Washington Post and from Politico, who say that she stands at 52 to 48% with 98% of votes counted. Oddly enough, and with the exact same margin in the 2nd District, the margin between Elaine Luria and Jen Kiggins has now thinned from 12% down to 4%. It is too close to call. There's still 2% of ballots to get through this evening. It looks like with about a 12,000 vote difference, a disparity in favor of Jen Kiggins, that Kiggins will hold that seat, taking it from January 6th committee member, Democrat Elaine Luria. But we will need to watch that as more results come in. We're not entirely sure where that will go. We are also looking at other key House races. It seems so far that the Democratic majority has thinned by 3 seats with the races that have been won thus far. 141 seats have been called for Republicans. 82 seats have been called for Democrats. We will see as the night goes on who will hold on to that majority. It will likely be Republicans at this point, with that many seats lost thus far in the evening. But we will have more information in the coming days and weeks, particularly in these ranked choice voting situations. Currently, the Senate is 44 to 43, favoring Republicans in the number of seats that are held. Tonight, 34 seats were available to take. 36 Democratic seats were up for were not up for election. 29 Republican seats were not up for election. This was meant to be a vulnerable year for Republicans going into the midterm, but since Republicans have been able to gain some ground. So we will see by the end of the night whether this 50-50 majority will be at the head of a split Congress, of a unified Congress, whether they'll be Democratic or Republican. That will more likely be seen in the next day or so, seeing as those are much less frequently, or at least the instances where there is a Senate seat up for grabs is not necessarily in one of those ranked choice voting systems. Apologies. we're getting late in the evening. I'm running out of words.
Yeah. And just one more thing. With Arizona, some information has came for the governor race. With only 50% coming in, reported in, Mark Kelly's at 58%.
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you there. That is the Senate race.
The Senate race.
So
oh yeah, my bad.
Sorry.
Yeah.
No, you are okay. We're going to take a look at this governor's race very quickly, and we will see where we stand. Apologies. Sorry.
I have the.
Not to take it out of your hands. If you have it, we're happy to take a look at it.
Okay. So 47% reporting in, 56% for Katie Hobbs, the Democrat, and then 43% for Kari Lake.
Okay. Now that's surprising.
Yeah.
I know we said we weren't going to have any commentary. We're going to have a very quick one on this because this is very surprising. Katie Hobbs was very much not expected to be where she is right now with 50% in. Now that will depend on where the votes come in for the rest of the night. There have been, as I said before, some challenges by the county Republicans in Maricopa County. We'll be looking across Arizona to see exactly where this goes next. But this far into the tabulation of these votes, almost half, having Katie Hobbs at about 57%, that's aligned with mail-in votes. That's aligned with absentee votes prior to the election. But 47% would be an incredibly high absentee turnout.
Yeah.
So we're at this point talking about same-day election ballots that were cast, and that's a very large margin to start from. So what do you think that means for Kari Lake? You know, Kari Lake had a lot of recognition going into this.
Yeah.
And so did Katie Hobbs. Katie Hobbs was the Secretary of State. Kari Lake was a former local news anchor. So what do you think if we take recognition out of this, because both of them have statewide appeal, both of them have statewide presence, maybe not appeal, but statewide presence. What do you think this looks like if Katie Hobbs can hold on to this?
Arizona's a very purple state.
Yes.
And with that in mind, I don't think Kari Lake can pull out with a victory here.
Okay.
And just traditionally, Arizona has usually punted more radical politicians from many seats. I believe what was the McMaster or
Blake Masters?
No. What was the candidate's name who ran for each Arizona seat and then subsequently lost each seats?
I am not sure actually. That would be a first I don't know of the night for me.
Well, there was a candidate who ran for like one seat for replacing McCain. Subsequently lost that election, then ran for the second Arizona seat, and then they lost that election there too as well.
Oh, you're talking about Mark Kelly's predecessor, actually.
Yeah.
I can't believe I'm forgetting this name. Who actually ran for both of those seats, was then but appointed to that Senate seat by Doug Ducey, the governor of Arizona, or the current governor of Arizona. It was Martha McSally.
Martha McSally, yes.
Martha McSally, the first female fighter pilot in American history, was a very far-right, very pro-Trump congresswoman who lost her bid for the Senate. She then ran for Senate she ran for Senate for Jeff Flake's seat after he vacated, for John McCain's seat after he passed away, against Mark Kelly, or not against Mark Kelly, was appointed to that seat, then attempted to run against Mark Kelly and lost both times.
Yeah. So I'm using that as an example as to why extreme candidates will not probably win Arizona. But it's only 50% reporting in, so we have yet to see what the results are. But yeah, cool.
No, absolutely. And that's true. That's true. Arizona has a very long history of punting more radical politicians. Doug Ducey, who is the current governor, did something very similar to what Kari Lake attempted to do. Kari Lake, I would probably argue, did it worse, particularly when, over the course of this last week, she attempted to kick out all of the former John McCain supporters from one of her rallies. but it's a very common tactic in Arizona that you run in a primary to the right in the Republican Party, and then you moderate yourself during the general. And I think Kari Lake attempted that. I think that former governors of Arizona attempted it and committed to it better. I would say Kari Lake had a lot of room for improvement.
Yeah.
And I don't mean that on a partisan level. I just mean Kari Lake, was attempting to juggle a lot. She was attempting to juggle the Trump factor. She was attempting to juggle the moderation, and she was attempting to juggle a lot of very far right
ideas.
Ideas, pressures from
Right.
within Arizona. Mark Bergovich, who's the current Attorney General, who continuously goes on to InfoWars and continually goes on to Breitbart and speaks with them about, what happened in 2020, and she needs his support as much as she needs, moderate Republicans like Jeff Flake, Cindy McCain, who serves in the Biden administration on an ambassadorial role. She needs their, not their support specifically, but support from that wing of the Arizona Republican Party. A wing of the Arizona Republican Party, by the way, that continually is censured. They are reprimanded by the state party. They are also censored by the state party. They have a lot of their platform taken away from them, but censured, which is a very traditional process of reprimanding a member of your party or a member of a particular body.
Yeah.
So I would agree. That that Arizona has that tendency, and that we should be there. Now, as for us, we have a tendency to run long, and we have a tendency to talk your ear off. So we're going to head on out now. No, Gabe, I'm going to hand it back to you for a moment.
Yeah. Well, we would like to thank our viewers, our patriots, for tuning in to this broadcast. It went on a lot longer than expected, but we appreciate you guys for showing up. We also appreciate anyone who's watching the VOD upload on YouTube later in the future. Really appreciate you guys. And yeah, you keep the date up on all news and other stuff on campus. If you follow us on Instagram at MCN on TV, and Facebook at Mason Cable Network, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. So yeah, I'm Gabe.
And I'm Orlando. And for more election results, keep up to date on the Associated Press website, apnews.com, on the New York Times website, Politico, the Washington Post. Just make sure that you're getting your updates from reliable news sources, and that can be anywhere that you trust your news to come from. But particularly in this election, we should look away from social media. We should be looking to trusted and traditional news sources. Good night, and enjoy the rest of your week. We'll be seeing these election results come in. Please stay safe. And remember, this is an election like any other. All of these are elections like any other. We will likely, we hope, particularly because of the unprecedented nature of these last elections, have another chance next year here in the state and in 2 years here on the federal level to continue electing trusted leaders to our government, and we are sure that that will happen, particularly here in Virginia, which is the birthplace of the United States.
Yeah. Well, thank you guys for tuning in. Good night.
Good night.